Over the next two videos, we're going to be previewing SwiftUI. And I want to stress preview because this is not meant to be a full-blown tutorial on SwiftUI. Like, that is an entirely different course, not just one or two videos. So I want to set those expectations, and I'm going to say it again in the next video. But anyway, like, what is SwiftUI? So as I mentioned in previous videos, SwiftUI was introduced to us just in the summer of 2019 at WWDC. So that's when it was announced. By the time it was like officially released and out of beta, it was late September of 2019. So here in early April 2020, it's only been released for 6 months. So it is very, very early in the game. And this is a fundamentally different way for us to build our UIs, not only on iOS, but across all the Apple platforms, right? macOS, iPadOS, iOS, watchOS. And I want to go back to how early we are in SwiftUI, just to stress that, because I know, especially after watching these two videos, you may get really excited about this and want to only learn SwiftUI. But just to reiterate what I said in the UI kit or SwiftUI, we're in a transitionary period that if you're trying to be an iOS developer in the next 2-3 years, you're gonna have to know both, again, because we are in that transition period. But before we go any further, I would recommend, especially since this course is for absolute beginners, learn one at a time. Like, it's fine to know what SwiftUI is and to like maybe play a little bit, but I don't recommend splitting your time 50-50. I would learn one and then learn the other. And I would learn UIKit first, because all those best practices in how we do things in UIKit are well established. The thing with SwiftUI, because it's so early, like for the past year, so here in June of 2020, it will be the 1-year anniversary of when SwiftUI was announced. So developers in the community have spent the past year like trying to figure it out. Like, we as a community don't know all the best practices yet, don't know what's the best way to build a SwiftUI app. And because we don't know, there's a lot of experimentation going on. The SwiftUI space is going to change drastically over the next couple years. So that's why I recommend learning UIKit first, because if you start trying to learn SwiftUI now, it's going to change and evolve so much that for a new beginner, like, that's a lot to keep up with. All right, now let's move on to like what it is and start talking about the overview. So here I have up a website from Apple. I'll link to it in the description, of course, but you can see here, introducing SwiftUI. And before we go any further, I'm sure you're going to be very interested in this. You can see this says SwiftUI tutorials in the upper left. And if you click on the right here, tutorials, you'll see a whole list of SwiftUI tutorials that Apple has created just for SwiftUI. And they're very, very well done. The community was super impressed by the SwiftUI tutorials Apple put out. Let's just say it is far and above what they usually do. So here you can see SwiftUI is a modern way to declare user interfaces for any Apple platform. Create beautiful dynamic apps faster than ever before. The key word I want to hang on here is declare, right? So let me put up this picture here so you can kind of see what's going on as I describe this. So the major fundamental difference I was talking about is in programming paradigms, right? So you have imperative programming in declarative programming. The way UIKit works is imperative. At a high level, the way imperative programming works is you tell the computer how to do something. Like, right, think back to our card workout app, like even just the view did load in our list of functions, right? We're telling the app or the computer exactly what to do and how to do it. That's why we're declaring all these functions and we're saying, run this function, then run this function, then run this function, right? We're telling it how to do things. Whereas declarative is where you kind of define or declare what you want to happen, and then the computer like figures out how to make that happen. Let me give you an example. So say you have two screen states, right? One is if the user's logged in, you're going to show this UI on the screen, the home screen. If the user's not logged in, you're going to show the login screen as you see here. So all you have to do with declarative UI is change the state of the screen, which is typically like an isLoggedIn variable, to on or off. And based on that variable changing, that is how the UI knows to update. It's kind of like watching that variable, that state is logged in, and then whenever you change it, it reacts to that change and automatically adapts its UI. So again, that's super high level, imperative versus declarative, but that is the fundamental difference between UIKit and SwiftUI. And I want to stress how different this paradigm is, because even experienced developers that haven't dealt with reactive programming in the past or declarative programming languages, we're all beginners. Like, this is brand new. And, I've done my fair share of courses and playing with SwiftUI and learning, and it was just like being a beginner again. Like, I use this analogy, right? It's like sports. Basketball and football, yes, they are both sports. So being athletic, a fast runner, like, sure, that skill carries over. But once you get down below, basketball and football are completely different skill sets. So that's the analogy, right? Like, sure, declarative and imperative or UIKit and SwiftUI, you're still programming, so general programming skills help, but it's like playing basketball versus playing football, right? They're totally different. So, all right, let's keep running down this website. But what you're looking at here is you have the code on the left and the canvas on the right. So this isn't storyboard, even though it kind of looks like storyboard. The way this works is you kind of get the best of both worlds. You'll see in the next video when we actually build a sample app that you can either do stuff on the canvas, so it kind of feels like storyboard, and then what happens when you drop something on the canvas, it automatically populates the code over in the code. So if you're the type that just prefers, typing out the code, no canvas, cool, you can do that. If you're the type that likes to be visual and drag and drop on the canvas, that will work too. And then when you drag it on the canvas, it'll spit out the code. It's actually kind of crazy. And again, you'll see that in the next video. So the canvas here is an amazing part of SwiftUI. Again, you'll see it in action in a bit. Let's keep it moving. So describe your layout just once. This is what we're talking about with declarative. That says declare the content and layout for any state of your view. SwiftUI knows when that state changes and updates your view's rendering to match. And just as an example, like see this table view on the right? I'm scrolling up, it won't scroll up any higher. I know that the non-vertical centering bothers me too, but it won't do it. See, I'm moving this, it's not moving. Anyway, this code right here, this is all the code it took to populate this table view. Now we've built a table view in our Colors app. Remember all that, we had to set the delegates, we had to put the table view on the screen, we had to set the constraints to declare it. None of that, right? There's no constraints in SwiftUI. And let's walk through this code real quick to give you an idea. Now, don't worry if you don't get it. We're actually going to dive into the code in the next video, but I'll walk you through this. So this list is basically our table view, right? A list. Look at the screen. It's a list. So what an H stack is a horizontal stack view. And you can see what's inside the H stack is the image, the text, and a spacer, and then another image. Let's walk through that. So the first image, where it's landmark.thumbnail, you see is this tree right here. The text, the landmark name, is Turtle Rock. The spacer is the space in between Turtle Rock and the star. And then you can see here's an if statement that, hey, if the landmark is marked as a favorite, then show the star. So you build this H stack, which is a view of horizontally stacked other views. So again, the horizontal stack is the image on the left, the text right next to the image, put a spacer in between, and then have the star on the right if it's marked a favorite. And then all the table view is a list of those views. So this whole table view is built in just this little bit of code. Of course, except for the data, right? Like landmark.thumbnail, like all that code is in a data model somewhere. But the actual UI code for the table view, like this is it. Like it's actually pretty amazing. And like I said, we're going to build one in the next video. Simplify your animations. We're not going to see this in the example. Again, this is not a huge, thorough tutorial, but animations are super, super easy in SwiftUI as well. And then you saw this, the Xcode, you see it live. What they mean by live is, you remember when we were building like our other apps, if we wanted to see the changes, we had to run it. Okay, pull up the simulator, cool, now we play with it. Well, as you're making changes, the canvas updates live. And even if you're running your app and you change the title, like it updates live. And again, we'll see that in action in the next video, but that is a great productivity win for development, right? Because you remember what it was like, right? We would make a change, all right, let's run it. Oh, that was broke. Okay, make the change, run it again. That takes a long time. All right, keep it moving. Okay, this is other stuff. But yeah, I highly recommend checking out this page. And the great thing that I forgot to mention is when you use these elements like this list, the reason it is a list and it is kind of generic, if you will, is because when you make a list like this, it translates that into whatever platform you're on. So for example, a list on a watch looks a lot different than this list. But because you've declared it like list, it's going to adapt for you, right? So by using SwiftUI, it goes across all the Apple platforms, right? Mac OS, watchOS. So it's a great way to kind of write the code once, and then you get all those other layouts. You don't have to create a full-blown separate Mac app. Again, that is high level. If you're converting an iOS app to a Mac app, there is some stuff you need to do. Of course, I'm not just saying it automatically transfers, but building it in SwiftUI does a lot of the heavy lifting for you. So to reiterate, before we move on to actually building something in SwiftUI, we're still very early. I know it's exciting to want to go learn SwiftUI, but as a beginner, you're going to be much better off learning UIKit first, because SwiftUI is still so early, so nascent, that things are going to change rapidly. Like, I don't know what's coming at WWDC in a couple months, but I'm expecting some big changes for SwiftUI, just like there was from Swift 1 to Swift 2 and Swift 2 to Swift 3. Like, Swift changed a lot during that time period. We're all expecting the same to happen with SwiftUI. So again, my recommendation is let us sort out SwiftUI first and then kind of come over and learn it, but definitely like take some time to play around with it. Again, my one big advice, don't split your time 50-50, right? Focus on UIKit first. That's what I would do if I was starting right now. In this SwiftUI preview, we're going to build this table view, which has my thumbnails and the YouTube video title and the date it was uploaded, and it's going to be in a table view. I'm going to show you how to build that in SwiftUI. Now, again, I stress SwiftUI preview, not SwiftUI beginner tutorial, because again, I know I've said this before, but I will reiterate. Explaining all the basics of SwiftUI, like that would be 10, 15 more videos. Like that's an entire other course. Good news, I plan on releasing that course by the end of 2020. Why so long? Why the end of the year? Because it is April of 2020 right now. Well, like I said in the previous video, I'm expecting big changes at WWDC this summer, and then it's got to go through beta and won't be officially released until fall of 2020. So that is why the end of the year, the SwiftUI course will come out. So if you're super interested in SwiftUI, stay tuned for that. But this is just a preview. Because again, the whole point of this course was just to expose you to the whole world and show you what exists and give you the high level concepts, right? But you will be able to follow along and type along with me and have this end result. I just may not stop and break down every little super basic thing. So again, feel free to follow along, but this is not meant to be a comprehensive, you understand every aspect of SwiftUI video. All right, that disclaimer out of the way, let's get started. Here we go. Open up Xcode. New project. Something's going to be different now. Single view app, that's fine. Now, we're going to call this SwiftUI videos. So I'm going to call it. And Sean Allen, put your information in there as always. Language is Swift. Here's the big deal. Not storyboard, SwiftUI. There we go. Hit next. Create. Oh, I guess one thing, might be a little too late now. SwiftUI does require Xcode 11 and macOS Catalina. So if you're not on macOS Catalina or you're not on Xcode 11, just watch the video. You can't type along. So that is one of the downsides of also, focusing on SwiftUI is that it requires all the latest and greatest equipment. And if somebody wants to use your app that uses SwiftUI, they have to be on iOS 13. Which might not be that big of a deal, but disclaimers nonetheless. All right, my canvas is loading up. There it is. It's awfully big. Let's minimize it. Let's actually minimize this right pane. We're not going to need that. Again, I want to make sure my environment is good. Okay, so here we are. As you can see, hello world. I'm going to click on that, and you see it automatically highlighted the code here on line 13 and put a nice little red box around that. You'll notice there's no constraints. There's no label, right? It just knows where to put it. Now to start building this up piece by piece, instead of hello world, let's put in video title so you can see what that is. This is what we're going to start building. Now below it, as you saw on the design here, we have our video title and then we have the date below it. So we're going to need another text right below it. So two options here. We're going to do it the quick way, and then I'll show you how you can do it just by typing it out too. So remember I said earlier, you can do a lot of stuff on the canvas and it'll put the code in automatically. That is how you may want to start out, because that is how you're going to learn basically how SwiftUI is working, what the modifiers are. But once you have done SwiftUI for a while and you have things memorized, you're probably going to be a lot faster typing. So just know that that's probably going to be your evolution of using SwiftUI. Start on the canvas and then eventually shift over to typing. So we're going to start with the canvas. Just like on Storyboard, hit the plus button up here, and you can see you have a whole list of stuff here. So let's type in text. That's what we want. So if I drag text onto here, and you can see, hold the button, and you can see like a solid red line. And look right below my canvas here. Add text in a new vertical stack. If I move it to the left, add text in a new horizontal stack. Same thing above it, add text to a new vertical stack. So a big thing with SwiftUI is VStacks and HStacks and ZStacks. So VStack is a vertical stack. An HStack is a horizontal stack, like I explained in the previous video, how their cell was horizontal. And then a ZStack is like layers on top of each other, right? Not to the left of it or to the bottom of it, like right on top of it. That's the Z stack. So we want to add this to a vertical stack right below it. So you can see how you have this solid red line here. Let go, and you're going to get the text below it. See, placeholder. Now look what it did to my code. It added the text here, and it automatically wrapped my two labels in a V stack, right? All by just dropping that onto the canvas. It fills in the code, like I said. Now you can kind of see, like, if you already knew you wanted a V stack with two labels in it, you probably could have typed this out faster than like dragging it and dropping it. So hopefully that illustrates what I'm talking about. Is you may start off on the canvas, but as you get better with SwiftUI, you'll migrate to actually just typing it. So we don't want this to say placeholder. We want this to say date uploaded, right? Okay. Now let's look here. They're kind of close here, like right. They're kind of squished together. But if I click on this VStack, you can see. So the VStack is only going to fill up as much space as it needs. So that introduces me to the concept of a spacer. So spacer will fill up like the rest of the space. So if in this VStack, I type a spacer down here, watch what happens. It shoves everything up to the top, because what you're looking at in this VStack is you have one text label at the top, another text for date uploaded, and then the rest of all this space on the phone is the spacer, right? So same thing, if I put the spacer in between the text, now look, boom, it split it up, top and bottom. So again, the VStacks fill up the entire, not necessarily the entire phone all the time, because again, you can have VStacks inside of VStacks inside of an HStack. Like there's layers to this stuff. But that is the basics of what like a spacer does. Now, we can add a modifier to the spacer. Oh, we're getting crazy. So let's do that here. We can do .frame, and then you can see we can give it a whole frame, width, height, whatever. We just want to give it a height. So I can actually like delete all these other ones. And the frame of my spacer, I want to give a height, is going to be 5, right? So you see now I just added a little bit of space in between video title and date uploaded. Now you may notice in our design, those are aligned left. Those aren't centered like they are right now. So if I click on my VStack, and here's the cool thing, if you command click on your VStack, and you can do this in code, watch, I command click, I get this menu, and hit show SwiftUI inspector, like this is the cool thing. You're gonna get all this stuff, right? So alignment, like we want this to be aligned left. So let's click on that, alignment, and look at my canvas. They align left instead of centered. Watch, I'm gonna hit them align right. Bam, they aligned right, centered, cool. And then, like I said, this is when you can start learning your modifiers, right? So here's the frame, padding, and you can hit add modifier. Now watch what happens when I click this. It gets crazy. You can see, look at all the, there it goes. I was hoping it got big like that. Look at all these modifiers. So this is what I was talking about, how using the canvas to help you learn these, before you have all these like memorized. But once you have them memorized, like I said, you can just type it out real quick. So these are all the different modifiers you can do. We're not going to add a modifier to this just yet. We just wanted to make sure our VStack was leading aligned, so they align left. Next, we want to add our image. Again, if you look at the design, the thumbnail image is to the left of our date and title. So our title and date are in a VStack by themselves. However, we want to put the picture to the left, so that would be an HStack, right? The left side of the HStack is my image. The right side of the HStack is the VStack that holds my title and date uploaded. So remember I said you can have HStacks inside of VStacks, inside of HStacks, like again, there's levels, but if you just picture the boxes and the items in the boxes, that should help you out. So we want to add an image. So hit the plus button, type image. Oh, I got to spell it right. Image, okay? Again, drag it onto your canvas. Now, again, we can add it in a vertical stack. That's not what we want to do, right? We want to put it on the left, and you see you get that solid red line, and it'll say add image to a new horizontal stack along the existing vertical stack, right? It tells you exactly what's going to happen. So we drop the image there. Well, there is no image because we don't have an image name. Okay, let's actually upload our images now. So I have these prepared, but I'm going to link to these images in the description so you can download them. But just like before, click on your assets folder, go to your finder that has the images. Here's 12 thumbnails of mine. Going to drag them in here. Cool. And we'll pick 9090 as our first. You see the name here. Let me click on it. 9090. That'll be the name of our image. So go back to the content view. Image name 90-90. Sometimes your automatic preview will get paused. If you just hit resume, that'll pop back up. Okay, not the desired effect, huh? Our image is huge. So to make our image fit, we want to give it a modifier. We want to give it the resizable modifier. So you can do image.resizable, and watch this update here. Well, maybe hit resume. Okay, still not the desired effect. What that did was that squeezed it into our HStack, right? You see the right side of our HStack is still our title and our date uploaded. The left side of our HStack is the giant picture, but it did squeeze it so it only fit on the left side. So what we want to tell it to do now is to keep the same aspect ratio, right? It's a 16:9. Make sure you keep the same aspect ratio, and that'll make it look better. And to do that, we can do .scaled to fit. scales the view to fit its parent, bam. We keep our aspect ratio there. Our image is a little big, right? It dominates the whole H stack, right? It's taken up like 60% of it. And again, if you look at our design, it's not, it's smaller. So what we can do here is also assign a frame to the image. Now you see me typing code, like I'm just kind of used to that. But again, what I can do is if I command click on the 90/90 rule image and say show SwiftUI inspector, you can see I can do my modifiers from here as well. So frame, I want to give a height. I want to give a height of 90. So I do that and I hit return. Look, it gave me a frame of 90 here right on line 16. And here you notice that's still not what we want. So order matters. This is kind of the biggest learning curve with SwiftUI. These are all called modifiers, by the way, what you can put on there. And the order of your modifiers matter. So you're going to see sometimes you just put some things in the wrong order and that doesn't give you the behavior you want. So like I said, I put the frame before scale to fit and that didn't give me the behavior. After scale to fit, now that's starting to look a little more like what we want. And the last thing we're missing from this is the corner radius. So again, command click on the picture. There's tons of different ways, right? I could just type dot corner radius, right? And then of 8. Bam. Like I said, once you know it, typing it is going to be so much quicker. But because you're a beginner, I want to show you, let me delete corner radius. I want to show you how to use the canvas because that's how you're going to learn and memorize all these modifiers. So hit show SwiftUI inspector. You can scroll down, add modifier. You see our whole list of modifiers, right? And then we're going to look for corner radius. That's what we're looking for here. Okay, cool. Corner radius. Let's add that. And you saw here, it gave me the code, right? It spit the code in here. It defaulted to 3. We're going to make it 8. That's what the design wanted. So now our image here is looking, let me kind of click off of this so it doesn't highlight in red. It's looking kind of like what we want. One thing I'm noticing here is the first is our video and title and our image are just squeezed a little bit too close together. So let's put a spacer in between them, right? So you see our H stack here. So you see the image is on the left side of the H stack and then our V stack is on the right. Well, in between them, let's add a spacer. And okay, remember the view fills up the whole screen. Well, you see by putting a spacer in the middle, it pushed the text all the way to the right and the image all the way to the left. So that's not quite what we want either. So again, remember how I gave the spacer down here a frame? Well, I can do the same thing. So I'm just going to Command V or copy and paste that, and not a height. We don't want a height on the spacer. We want a width, right? Because we're in the horizontal stack. So let's make the width 16. Again, this is just based on design. Okay, so that's good, proper spacing that I want. Now to avoid confusion, you may notice how I'm just typing this list of modifiers here, and it's like a vertical stacking list, right? Like this. But on the spacer, I just did dot frame. So if I only have one thing I'm adding to the spacer, I like to put it on one line. And this is pure stylistic choice, by the way. However, obviously, if you have 4 of them, it makes sense to put it on multiple lines rather than doing like image.resizable.scale-to-fit.frame like all on one line. That becomes very hard to read. So again, if I only have one thing, I like to put it on one line. Now let's play around with the text here. Instead of video title, let's actually put the name of this. So say the 90/90 rule. And I'm testing like how this label works. So the 90/90 rule is a great rule. I'm seeing how this works. You see how it's spaced and gave me a live update. Let's add some modifiers to this text. So this is our title. So let's give it a font weight. So as you can imagine, there is a dot font weight modifier here. And again, you could do the same thing. You could click on your canvas, find the modifier, drag it onto the canvas. Again, I'm just quicker typing, kind of the habit. So again, if you hit dot, here's your font weights, bold, heavy, whatever. We're going to do semi-bold for this title. And then we want to limit the lines because watch, if I kept writing, the 90/90 rule is a great rule. It is so awesome. I'm going to misspell this, whatever. It should be 3 lines. Like you can see, our label just keeps growing and growing and growing. Well, we want to limit this to 2 lines because again, our title shouldn't be that long. So we can do that. Dot line limit makes sense, 2. So that way it's always going to be just 2 lines. And then you can do dot minimum scale factor, 0.25. This means like, hey, if you get to that line limit of 2 and you still have more words, you can shrink the size of the font up until 25%. That's actually pretty low. We're going to make this like 75%. That way it only shrinks a little bit before truncating rather than making like a size 4 font that you can't even read. And then similarly onto our date uploaded, again, let's just put a sample date in here so we can get to like really see what this looks like. January 23rd, 2020. That's not the real date, but we want to see it. So we want to give this a different font or a font type here. So font, and we want to do dot sub headline. Again, you can do different like call out, footnotes, caption, large title. Sub headline makes it a little bit smaller, and we can also give it a color. So dot foreground color, and we want to do dot secondary. So again, these are the system UI colors that'll change via dark mode and light mode. A secondary color, right? It kind of makes sense. The primary color is like the big bold black on a white screen, or it'll be white on a dark screen. The secondary color will be a little bit lighter, as you can see here on our canvas of January 23rd. So that is how we want to format our text. Now, you may notice we're pinned all the way to the edge on the picture and pinned all the way to the edge on the text, right? There's no padding there. Well, when we put this into our list or our table view, that's going to take care of that for us. Now, watch this, right? So here's our HStack, right? Our HStack embodies this entire view we just created, right? With the image that we formatted on the left side of the HStack. There's a small little spacer in the middle to give us that padding. And then we have a VStack on the right of the HStack that holds our text. Well, watch. If I do Command click on the HStack, look at this. Embed in list. Bam, table view. Embed in list, you get a table view. Of course, we got to format it and change it, but now we have a table view. Like, that's crazy. And you can see here, the list is 0 up until 5. So that's going to give us 5 images, but you can imagine if we change that to 0 ... up until, 20, that'll give us 20 of them. As you can see, our canvas filled. And then if we run it, this little play button here will run your preview. So hit that, and now you're getting essentially a simulator here once the preview is done loading, that you can actually interact with and use on your app. So here we are. Look, I'm now scrolling up like that. That was like, what, 20 items? Again, so our basic table view, like we literally just built a view, command clicked it and said, put it in a table view, and it did it. Like, that's crazy. And now if we're scrolling down here, you notice it's going right up to the top of the screen. What if we want like a navigation bar up top? Well, that's pretty simple too. Now we want to wrap our list inside a navigation view. So up here, I'm going to type in navigation view. You saw it right there. Open and close brackets. So this can get tricky sometimes with SwiftUI, not gonna lie, like where the brackets go. So if you go left and right over the bracket on your arrow keys, you can see it's highlighting the list bracket up there in yellow. So I need a bracket below this for the item view. And here's another neat little trick. If you highlight your whole struct, do Control-I, it like lines up everything for you, the alignment here. So here we have a navigation view. We broke our preview. Let's stop running that because we like changed code. But you can see at the top now, we have like a navigation bar because we put it in a navigation view. And then now on our list, we can give a navigation title for what we want this list to be called. So I can do dot navigation bar title, as you can see here. And then we got to pass in a text of Sean's videos. And you see it's updating live on our preview. And the tricky thing that caught me off guard too is you would think this navigation bar title would be the dot on the navigation view, right? If I go back and forth on this curly brace, you can see this is the navigation view curly brace. Well, you have to put this navigation bar title on this list here. So little note in case you messed that up. But now let's run our preview again. And now look, you see our nav bar at the top. As we're scrolling up, we get Sean's videos at the top, just like that. Super simple. And look, I'm running my app, right? It's running like on the simulator. Let's say I want to change Sean's videos to Sean's videos part 4. Look, it updated right. We're still live. The navigation bar updated. Part 3, not part 4, whatever. You get the idea. So yeah, we're updating this live, and it was super quick to create this table view. And you see when we put this in the table view, it gave us some of the default padding here on the left. Remember before it was in the table view? Okay, I'm going to call it table view by accident, but it's really called a list now. So that's going to be an old habit to die hard here. But you can see on the left, we get the padding. That's because we put it into a list, and SwiftUI knows like what a list should look like. And it has the built-in padding, built-in margins. Like we got everything for free. Like that's the power of SwiftUI. We have our list of videos, but they're all the same video. Let's actually put some data in this here. So for that, we're going to create a new file in your folder. Command N. We're going to create kind of our data model here. Swift file, call this video, hit create. I'm going to drag this up here. And here's where we're going to create a struct for our model here. We want to do struct video. We want to create a video object here. That video object has 3 properties, right? It has a var image name. We're just going to get the name of the image, which that is a string. It also has a var title. We'll say video now. Just title. That is also a string. And it has a upload date, which is also a string that we're going to put in there. So that's our video object. again, back to our content view, you can see we're going to have an image name that we're going to create an image out of. We have to pass in a title, and we have to pass in an upload date, right? So that's our video. Now, in order for our list here to use our video object, it has to conform to a protocol called identifiable. So identifiable, that's how it knows what it is. And when you're identifiable, you have to have a, see, look, it says video does not conform to protocol identifiable. It's because we have to have a ID variable. So we'll do var ID, and that equals a UUID, and we'll initialize a new one. UUID stands for universally unique identifier. So anytime we create a video, you see we're initializing a new one. So we're initializing a brand new UUID for this specific video object. So this is the basic object of a video. Now let's create some dummy data. So we'll do that here, struct video list. And this would be the equivalent, like maybe let's say we're downloading our video list, but we're kind of mocking that data here. And I'm actually going to copy and paste this because you would watch me type for the next 15 minutes doing this. Maybe not 15 minutes. I'm selling myself short on my typing skills, but let me copy and paste this, and you can pause the video and type it in as well. But I don't want to bore you just watching me type this out. You'll see it's a bit. All right, paste. So there you go. I have a static variable called top 12 of my videos. So this is 12 videos. You can see here on line 20, we're initializing a video with an image name, 37 tips. There should actually be a space here. Option drag space. There we go. It has a title. There's my title that we're passing in. It has an upload date that we're passing in. Like I said, I manually typed in all this data. In a real app, we'd probably be downloading this from the internet. But again, this is our mock data that we're going to use to populate our table view. So back to our content view, we have to update our content view a little bit. So not as part of this body. You'll notice this is a variable called body that is a view. Like our whole screen is like a view. So we don't want to mess with that variable. We want to create a new one. So var videos, and you see that is of type an array of video, and that is going to equal an empty array right now. So you see in this down here in the list on line 17, instead of 0 through 20, very similar to how number of rows in section when we built our table view, how we could either pass in a hard-coded number. Remember we did 50 for the colors app, or we could pass in, colors.count to give it whatever was in the array. It's very similar to what we're doing here by passing in videos to our list. That is saying however many number of videos are in this array, that is how many cells we should have. And then now item, this is just a renaming. Item will still work, but that doesn't make as much sense if we called it video. Right? Not video, it's just video. So basically this is kind of like a for loop, right? Like for every video in videos, do all this stuff. So instead of the image, instead of passing in 9090, we're going to pass in video. Again, this video that we have here as it iterates through video.image name. There we go. Xcode was not behaving. Sometimes that happened, especially in SwiftUI. Again, super new. So video.image name. Same thing down here with the text. We're just replacing the hard-coded stuff with whatever video is in the list here. So we want to do video.title. And same thing down here with the upload date, video.upload date. Not getting autocomplete, not sure why. Okay, cool. So we've replaced all of our hard-coded stuff with whatever video we pass in, which again is in this array of videos, which we created, again, if you remember down here on our struct called video list, we created an array called top 12, which has our 12 videos in it. So again, back to content view, let's run this on our preview. All right, hit resume here. Now it's running on the preview. Empty table view. We lost everything. What did we do? Well, think about it. It's a blank table view because, we changed all this stuff. We haven't told this array of videos what's in it, right? Like it's an empty array. So here in this preview struct, this is what actually generates the preview here on the right. You'll notice content view will now be able to take in a parameter, right? Because we have a variable called videos on our content view. So watch, if I just delete the initializer there, open it up, you see now we get a parameter called videos that we can pass in. So what this is saying is, hey, show my preview, but pass in an array of videos to my content view. And again, content view is this whole thing we've been working on. So what array do we want to pass into our content view? We want to give our content view video list.top12, right? Again, just to reiterate, and you see, look at that, immediately updated, bam, and it's running. Like I can scroll and everything. So you see the power of SwiftUI and how fast things load. And you see based on the array we created here, with the image name, the title, the upload date on all those videos, that is populating here. You see we get 37 tips for junior software developers. And you can scroll down through, some of my recent videos here. You see we get the video image, we get the title, we get the upload date, Again, so you saw, yeah, it took a little bit of time because I was explaining everything and going slow, but we just built this table view with a custom cell very quickly. And then again, look, like here's all the code. Like, of course, we had our data model over here. Like that's a little bit of code, of course, but the UI code, not a lot. So there you have a quick Swift UI preview. Again, you can see it's vastly different. It's a fundamentally different way to program your UI than what we're used to with UIKit. But that was a preview. I would say happy to answer any questions in the comments, but to be honest with you, I've only done the very, very basic layer of Swift UI. So if you have very deep questions, feel free to ask them and hit up the Slack as well. I'm just not going to promise I'm going to answer them. However, like I said, my whole year after this course is released as of April is dedicated to Swift UI because I have a product in mind that I'm going to build fully in Swift UI and Catalyst and have it be across all platforms. So yeah, so the next 8 months, 100% Swift UI for me. And then, like I said, by the end of the year, have a pretty basic beginner course on Swift UI. But anyway, that's it. I'm pretty excited for the future of iOS development, which is clear that's going to be Swift UI. Again, we're just not there yet. And even if you're super excited about this, I would definitely learn UIKit first. And again, like I said, Swift UI is going to go through a phase over the next year or two of constant changes, and we're figuring it out. But anyway, that's the preview. Hope you enjoyed it. On to the next video. So many times when I was just learning, I remember hearing about a concept and being like, I didn't even know that was a thing. Like, I didn't know that existed. Well, that is what this section is meant to help out with. As I've said many times, the goal of this course is to expose you to this world. So I don't want you to be overwhelmed by these topics. We're going to talk about how most apps typically work, between a server and a client, right? For example, if you're on Twitter, your tweets got to live somewhere and that's off on the server. We're going to explain how that process works. We're going to talk about version control, which is essentially, a save state for your code base, and it allows development teams to work together. We're also going to talk about third-party libraries, how you can bring in like a module of other people's code into your program. And then we're also going to talk about various career paths a developer can take, right? You can go big company, you can be a freelancer. We're going to dive into that. Now, as I've said before, the whole goal of this course is to just expose you to this world. So please don't feel overwhelmed when you're watching these videos that you don't know this stuff. The concepts in these videos could be entire courses in and of themselves. And again, I don't want to overwhelm you, but like I said, I want to let you know that this exists. So don't worry if you don't fully get all these concepts yet. These are things that you will learn later on in your journey. They're not really for absolute beginners. But again, like I said, so many times I was like, I didn't even know this existed. Well, again, in this section, we're trying to fix that problem. So how do most apps work? Obviously, it's a pretty broad question and could be 20 courses in and of itself to explain everything. So of course, we're going to keep this high level, simple, and we're going to talk about apps that deal with the server and client dynamic, which again is most apps. First, let's simply define, server and the client. So the server is something you may think of as like the cloud, and the client is either your phone, your iPad, maybe your iMac, your laptop. Like that is the client. So for example, let's take Twitter, right? Your tweets, they live in Twitter servers, right? They live off in the cloud. However, when you open up your phone and pull up Twitter, the server sends all those tweets and all that information to your phone, the client, and then the client, processes that information and displays it on the phone. So again, all the data lives on the server, right? All the tweets, all that stuff. And then you have to have Wi-Fi or a cellular connection to pull that down from the server. So why I reiterated that is because I want to talk about that data that gets passed. Typically, it's via JSON, JSON, or JavaScript Object Notation. Here on the screen, you can see a very simplified JSON of what a tweet might be, right? You can see who tweeted it, you can see the tweet message, you can see when they tweeted it. And I say this is an overly simplified version of a tweet because a tweet is going to have a lot more data, right? You have like the avatar, if the tweet has a video or an image, you got all the people that liked it, all the people that retweeted it. So again, this is just a super simplified version to illustrate the point. So what gets sent from the server, again, the cloud, to your phone or your iPad or your computer is a list of these JSON objects that are the tweets. So the client's job, which is again, the phone, the iPad, the computer, is to take this JSON, parse through it, and make it look pretty on the screen, right? Like the running joke is that 90% of iOS development is just hitting a server, parsing the JSON, making it look pretty on the screen. And it's not far from the truth. Like this is a core fundamental skill in iOS development. This is called networking. However, networking isn't something super beginner developers need to learn. Even though it's a fundamental skill, it's something you're going to learn later on in your journey. But again, just knowing the fundamentals of the server, the client, seeing this JSON that you have to parse to make look pretty on the screen, just knowing that at a high level gives you a head start when it comes time to learn networking. Because ask any developer that's gone through this journey, networking is one of the more difficult things to learn, and it always trips people up, especially parsing through the JSON. Now, again, not all apps have this server client dynamic. Like some apps, typically games, all live on your phone. So if you ever had an app where if you deleted the app, you lost all the information on the app, that means no data was living on a server. All the data was living on the client, which is the phone, the iPad, the computer. So that's a different dynamic. But again, most apps, the Facebooks, the Instagrams, the Twitters, like most apps have data on a server, right? Because in this day and age, you want to be able to log onto your iPad and get the same data that you can log onto your computer and get, right? A lot of stuff lives in the cloud, so to speak. So again, this server client dynamic, again, is fundamental knowledge. And I oversimplified this just to be clear, because again, this course is about just exposing you to this and teaching you just the very fundamentals. So when it comes time to learn this networking, like you have the fundamental knowledge of how it all works. Now you just need to learn the implementation details. All right, as always, if you have questions, hit me up in the comments or in Slack. See you in the next video. Now let's talk about what is an API. First of all, it stands for Application Programming Interface. And there's two very common ways that you will use them as an iOS developer. The first is for making network calls. As I explained in a previous example, right, the Twitter and the server going down to the client of the phone. There's an API involved there. We'll talk about that in a second. And the second way you use them is Apple's own APIs, right? Like we talked about earlier in the course, how, Apple has laid down this foundation and we're building on top of that foundation. Well, how we interact with that foundation is via APIs, or the Application Programming Interface. Let's dive into those two examples. So back to our Twitter example of how all the tweets live on Twitter server and our client requests the information to give me the list of tweets to show your Twitter feed. Well, the client doesn't reach into the server itself and grab them. The server has an API, and the client communicates with the API. It requests information, and the API on that server is what handles those requests and also sends the information it needs. So again, our client isn't going directly into the server and grabbing the information. The client deals with the API sends back the information. Now, an API on a server, they're all over the place. Sometimes they're open, meaning any developer can access them. Sometimes the API is closed, like in the Twitter example, only Twitter developers can access that Twitter API for specific stuff. Sometimes they're free, just open to anybody to use. Often those are what's called rate limited, which means you can only send up a certain amount of requests. Sometimes it's per second, sometimes it's per hour, sometimes it's per day, depending on the API, but they limit how much you can use it. And sometimes APIs charge, right? They've done a lot of work gathering this data. They've built their server, they've built their API. And if you want to use it, you have to pay for it, per a certain number of requests typically. So there's a wide variety of APIs you can use. In fact, I'm going to link in the description. There's a resource with a bunch of free APIs. I'm actually going to attach my YouTube video that I did about it too on this lesson. So go ahead and watch that video and then check out that link to see a bunch of free APIs. And the cool thing about looking at those APIs is you can get a peek at what the JSON looks like. Remember, the JSON was the JavaScript object notation. Well, you can see if you have an idea for an app, you can kind of see if there's an API out there that will give you the information you need. And then you can even look at the JSON, okay, here's what I'm going to get back from this API. Does this have all the information I need? And if the answer is yes, cool, you can use that API and build your app. So that's the example of using the API, as a way to communicate with a server to get information. Now let's talk about the example of using Apple's APIs to build your apps. As I mentioned in the beginning of this video, Apple laid the foundation and we interact with that foundation via the API. Here's an example, right? We can do view.backgroundColor equals green. That's all we have to do to make a green background. We don't have to actually write the code to make the green color show up on the screen, right? All we have to do is interact with the API saying view.backgroundColor equals green, and then all of Apple's code will actually do what it takes to make green show up on the screen, right? We don't actually have to do all that. Another example that we've used previously in this course is when we sorted our ages array, when we were learning about arrays, right? All we had to do was ages.sort, right? That is us interacting with Apple's APIs. We didn't have to write a sorting algorithm to actually sort the array, right? That's all Apple's magic code. We're just interacting with their API and just saying, hey, ages.sort, and we're done. So those are basic examples of how Apple has done a lot of the heavy lifting to make it very easy for us developers to build our apps. Again, we're interacting with their APIs for them to do all the heavy lifting. And all the frameworks have the APIs, right? There's the core location, MapKit, ARKit, right? Like these all have APIs that we can interact with, right? When we interact with MapKit, we're not building a map, you know what I mean? Like the map's already there. We're just interacting with it via the API. So now hopefully when you hear a developer say like, oh, is there an API for that? Like they're probably meaning the server type API because they want to know if they can hit that API to get the information they need. Or you may hear an iOS developer say something like, oh, I really love the SpriteKit API. What they're saying is they like the set of tools Apple has given us in order to work with SpriteKit. So anyway, those are the two most common ways you're going to use an API. Again, application programming interface, vital fundamental knowledge. Hope you enjoyed. On to the next video. All right, version control. What is that? Let me preface this by saying this is a big and complex topic, but again, as you've heard me say time and time again, we're just going to scratch the surface just so you know what it is. So again, if you feel overwhelmed, don't worry about it. You'll learn much more about this along your journey, but it is a vital skill that you're going to have to know before you get a job and work on a team. Because like I said, all development teams use this. It's at the core of development. So what is it? Well, one use is that it's essentially a save state for your code base. Let me use a video game example that I think many can relate with. Do you remember playing a video game and before you got to a big boss or maybe a really hard part in the game, you would save? And then that way you could die on the boss, or if you lost one of your key weapons, or if you just really messed up, you could always go back to that save state and try again. That's essentially what version control does with your code base. Let's use another example from Luna, like this slide up card with a chart. Like that's a pretty big feature. And you can imagine if you're writing code without a save state, like I may not know how to build that feature right away. There's probably a lot of experimentation on getting things to work right. So if I was just working on my code base and I realized halfway through, like, oh man, I really messed this up. Like, how do you unwind that? How do you go back? Well, again, version control can let you like have a save state. So basically what I would do before building this feature is I would be like, all right, let me save my progress right here. There's an actual word for it called commit. More on that later. But just to keep it in, normal people's terms, have my save state right before I tackle this big feature. That way, if I just mess up my code base completely, no big deal. I can go back to that save state right before I started that. So back to that word commit. So that's the lingo, right? We don't call it a save state. You say, all right, I'm going to commit my code, and then now that's the save state, and now I can mess up my code base entirely, and I can always go back to that commit. The cool thing is you're making a ton of commits all throughout your code base as you're building your product, and you can go back to any commit, right? So you can unwind it back to 6 commits before. Like again, let's say, you've written this huge feature and you've been committing along the way, and then you realize, oh crap, I messed up, or maybe we don't really want this feature. Again, you can go back any number of commits to specific save states. And that's a nice insurance feature because I know when I first started coding, I was so worried that I was going to mess up the code base, like I was going to break it. Well, the beauty of version control is, for the most part, like you can't break your code base because again, you can always unwind it. Don't get me wrong, sometimes unwinding it and doing all that stuff is a giant headache, but for the most part, it's always possible. So that was a very simplified example of, keeping save states of your code base along the way. Now let's talk about how development teams use this to build their products, right? You ever wondered how big companies have development teams of 10 to 20 developers all working on the same code base and how all that works? Well, let's talk about that. Let's talk about Git and GitHub. Maybe you've heard of these things. First thing, and I didn't know this for a while, but like Git and GitHub are not the same thing. So let's talk about what they are. Git is version control that runs on your local machine. Let's define some terms real quick too, local and remote. Local means it's on your computer, right? Anything you have locally, let's say you threw your computer into a lake. Well, you're going to lose all that data because it was locally on your machine. Whereas remote lives on a server somewhere. So you could throw your computer in a machine, but you got your code base remotely up on a server. So just buy a new computer and download that code base and you're good to go. Okay, so that's local and remote. And again, Git is the version control on your local machine. GitHub is an online server to put your Git repositories up on the server. And real quick, there are other services like Bitbucket that kind of do the same thing as GitHub. Those are kind of niche. GitHub is the dominant player in the space. So a simplified example of how development works with Git and GitHub. I'm writing my code base on my local machine. I build my feature or my save state, my commit. I want to send that commit up to GitHub so it lives on the remote repository. And again, you want it on that remote repository. That way you can pull down that code base on any machine, right? Say you have a work laptop or a personal laptop, or you're working between a laptop and a desktop computer. It's all the same, right? Because the code base lives remotely in the cloud and you can pull that down to any machine, right? And that's what GitHub does. GitHub stores those repositories. Now let's talk about how development teams use this to collaborate on one project. Now, again, I'm going to give a very simplified example because this can get very complex. Like I said, you have development teams of 20 to 50 to even 100 people working on one code base. So you can understand that that can get very, very complex. But again, just the simplified version, just so you have an idea of how it works. Here we go. So the power of Git is a concept called branching. So let's walk through a visual example so you'll understand this. So typically you have a master branch. And let's say we're working on the version 5 of Twitter. So on this master branch is always the version that's on the App Store. And the reason you want that is because if a user has a bug or bugs pop up, you want to be able to go to the version of the code base that the users are actually using. So that's typically master. Now, of course, we're on version 5. We want to eventually get to version 5.1 or 5.2. So we need to be able to work on the code base, but not affect the master branch that the users are actually using. So this is, again, where you branch off of master. And again, typically the first branch off is called something like dev or development. So again, the very simplified example, we branch off development, we do all of our work on development that is going to go into version 6, and then when version 6 is ready, we merge development into master. Now master is on version 6, and that's when we push that version to the App Store. And now that version 6 is on the App Store, that's what the master branch is, and then we continue that cycle all over again. For version 7, we got to branch off onto dev, do all of our work, merge it back in for version 7. Now let's expand on this example a little bit because I just kind of, waved my hand over what was going on the dev branch. Let's actually zoom into the dev branch and talk about what happens between version 5 and 6, right? Because remember, I just said we do all of our version 6 work and then we merge it back in. Well, let's zoom in on that. Now remember, we talked about working on a team. So different developers can branch off of this dev branch. So let's say I want to build a feature where I'm building the chart, and another developer wants to build a feature where they're implementing new changes to the profile screen. So once we have the dev branch, I will branch off of dev to build all the chart stuff. And my teammate, the other developer, will also branch off of dev to do the profile stuff. Now, maybe their change was a lot more fast than mine, right? I'm building a whole chart. They're just updating the profile screen. So they would have their fixes and they would merge back into dev like you see here. And I'm still working on mine. But as you can see, dev has changed since I branched off of that. So what I can do is, my teammate will be like, hey, Sean, I finished my profile work. I merged it back into dev. If you want to pull down the latest dev into your branch, that way you can have all the changes. So what I can do is I can pull in the latest version of dev into my branch and keep working on my own branch, but that ensures that I have the latest version of dev. Now, the reason you want to do that is, as you can imagine, like let's pretend, my feature is huge. It's going to take me 2 months to build. So I'm on my own branch. Well, dev is constantly being worked on, so dev is going to change a lot before I'm ready to merge my changes back into dev. So that is why I want to constantly be pulling in the new dev into my branch to make sure I'm up to date and I'm not like breaking anything. Also, what can happen there is something called merge conflicts. You may be thinking this already. If you have multiple developers working on the same code base and then you try and merge it all together, like what if you were working on the same, screen in the same line of code? Like whose changes, get merged? Well, merge conflicts can be a headache, and they do happen with teams. Good communication on like what section of the app you're working on is a good way to avoid it, but that can happen. So again, that's another benefit of consistently bringing in the dev branch into my branch. So if there are merge conflicts, they're likely to be small and easily fixable. Whereas if I just worked by myself for this long time on the dev branch, and then 2 months later tried to merge my branch back into dev is going to have changed so much. Very likely there's going to be a lot of merge conflicts and it's going to be a headache to untangle. All right, I worry going on that merge conflict tangent might have been overwhelming. Don't worry about merge conflicts right now as a beginner. You're going to deal with that way later in your journey. But again, just know that they exist. And back to how these branches work. Eventually, I'll merge my changes into dev. The other developers will merge their changes into dev. The team will say, okay, great, version 6 is ready. And then we merge dev as a whole back into master for version 6 to push to the App Store. So that's how a team of developers from all around the world can work on the same code base, right? Because the code base lives on GitHub on the remote server. So like I said, my teammate could be like, hey, Sean, I push my changes up to the dev branch. He pushes them up to remote, and I could be living across the world, and I can pull down his changes into my computer to work on the latest version of the app. Now, again, these were all pretty simplified examples. Like I said, a team of 20 to 50. You can imagine how this can get pretty complex. But again, at least you know this exists now. If you are confused, that's perfectly fine. This is a confusing topic. Comment section as always, and then feel free to hit up the Slack channel to ask questions about it. Everybody in there is more than helpful. See you in the next video. Let's talk about third-party libraries, or you may hear them called dependencies or just libraries. It's all the same thing. What these are, it's basically a module of code that other developers have written that you can bring in and use into your code base. Let me give you an example. Here in the Aluna app, we track the user's measurements via a chart that you can see here. Now, creating a whole line chart that can be flexible and dynamic and take in different date ranges, that's a lot of work. So in this case, we brought in the third-party library called Charts to help us make this chart. Now, of course, you can customize it. As you can see, the colors match the app, but the core foundation of building the chart was completed by the library. Now, these libraries are often hosted on GitHub, so you can go check them out. So for example, here is the Charts library. It'll show you how to use it. It'll have the documentation and even some pictures, hopefully if it's a good one, of what it does. So as you can see, there's various different types of charts in this library. And just to give you a couple more examples of what you can do with libraries, here's a progress HUD. Here we have some different transitions you can do via view controllers. And then there's other libraries that can help you out with like your networking code, to talk to the server and the client. And there are a ton of libraries out there that you can use, but that's where you got to be careful. But we'll get back to that later in the video. Let's talk about how you go about using these libraries, because you may have heard these words before, right? You may have heard CocoaPods, Carthage, Swift Package Manager. Those are what you would use to install these libraries. Now let me give you the lay of the land real quick, because this area is changing as we speak, right? CocoaPods is the incumbent. They've been around for years. This was the main way people installed their libraries in iOS development. And then Carthage came along a few years ago and was kind of a competitor to CocoaPods. However, Swift Package Manager, that is Apple's first-party dependency manager. And that just came out, I believe, a year or two ago. So that is still pretty new. But even though it's new, it's rapidly gaining popularity amongst developers. And in my opinion, in another year or two, Swift Package Manager is going to be like the default way all developers do it. We're kind of in a transitionary period. So the advice to you just learning is when you do decide to tackle these third-party libraries, again, I don't recommend it for beginners. Don't worry if you don't fully understand all this now. This is more for later in your journey. But just remember, when it comes time to third-party libraries, you're going to see a lot of information about CocoaPods out there because, again, they were the incumbent for so long. But Swift Package Manager is what I would be learning if I was just starting today. Now, let's talk about those downsides, because I know you may be thinking, wow, if there's a library for just about everything, man, I can just find a library, put it together like a puzzle, and there's my app. And I get your logic. I understand that. And that's how a lot of web development is. But I wouldn't do that in iOS development. The general rule of thumb is that using libraries is okay, but use them sparingly. And here's why, right? They're called dependencies for a reason. You're depending on other people's code. And as you may know, or may not know, Swift is a rapidly evolving language because it's only 5 years old. It's still kind of growing. And also the iOS platform constantly changes, right? iOS 13, iOS 14, the new phones with the notch. So the platform and the language are constantly evolving, which is fine. That's actually what I like about it. But if you find yourself using 20 libraries, now you're counting on those 20 developers to keep their library up to date. And trust me, it is very, very common for libraries to get abandoned and no longer maintained. Like you'll go to it and it'll say the last update was 2 years ago. Well, that's pretty much a dead library. So not only do you have to use them sparingly, you got to be careful in which ones you used to make sure that they're actively maintained. Now, the good news is the most popular ones, like this chart ones, as you can see here, you always want to look for the stars on the GitHub repo. That's a good indication of how popular it is, which is a direct proxy to how much it's used. So the more it's used, the more it's apt to be, actively maintained. Because again, if you're relying on a library for a key piece of functionality in your app, and then all of a sudden that library stops being maintained, now you're stuck with this old code, and as Swift updates, as iOS updates, now you have to maintain it yourself or find a different one. And again, that's just one example. Imagine if you're using 20 or 30 libraries, now you're probably gonna have 4 or 5 that are dealing with that, and you're just gonna have a headache in your code base all the time. So again, the rule of thumb, use them sparingly, make sure they're well maintained, you'll thank yourself later. Another downside to using them is you get a lot of bloat. Like, let's go back to this charts repo real quick. You see all these different charts you can do? Like, that's pretty cool. That's a pretty nice feature of the library. However, most likely if you bring in this library, like we do at Illuna, we just wanted the line chart. Well, when you bring in that library, you're bringing in all the code for all those other charts and all the functionality behind those charts. So typically bringing in these third-party dependencies, you're bringing in a lot of bloat, meaning a lot of extra code that you don't need. For example, in the Illuna code base, I believe you can run a command to see the lines of code in your project. And the Illuna code base, when I did this, was like 6,000-7,000 lines of code without libraries. When I added the libraries, which there was about 5 or 6 of them, it went up to like 60,000 lines. So you can see a 10x in bloat from bringing in the libraries. So just keep that in mind as well. You're really ballooning the size of your app by bringing those in, which again may not be a bad thing. It may be a necessity, but again, just something to keep in mind. And the last bit I want to talk about is when you're deciding like when you should use a library, because oftentimes, new inexperienced developers will say, why would I reinvent the wheel? Like, somebody's already written this code. Let me just use that. It'll save me 2 weeks worth of work. And I get that thinking, but if you're building a product or you're building a startup or a business around your app and you plan on this app being around for 2, 3, 4, 5 more years, that 2 weeks or a month you took up front will be nothing in the grand scheme of things, and you'll be so much better off that you wrote it yourself and you have control of that code. You're not depending on some library to do it. So again, these are just some things you should be thinking about when it comes time to use a library. Again, use them sparingly. If you overdo it, you're gonna have headaches, trust me. And then also the ones you do choose to use, make sure they're actively maintained and they're going to be around for the next year or two. So that's the overview on libraries. Of course, as always, if you have questions about this, read the comment section or, post a comment down below. And as always, we have the Slack channel. See you in the next video. When we're building or designing our apps, oftentimes we start with what's called the happy path or the golden path. Right? This is how we're designing our app. This is how we want users to use our app. This is how users are supposed to use our app, right? However, once your apps are out in the wild, out in the real world, it doesn't always work like that. And you have to handle what are called edge cases, right? These are kind of not the normal way to use your app, but you still have to handle it. Like, let's walk through some examples. How does your app work when there's a very, very bad internet connection or no internet connection at all? Like, can you handle that? Or what if you're in a really crucial function in your app and the user just kills your app, right? Just, swipes up on the screen, kills the app. How does your app handle that? Or what if you're expecting an email in the field, right? You want to collect the user's email and the user just types 13 emojis. Can you handle that? Or what if, your app requires location permissions and the user actually gave you those location permissions. However, 3 weeks later, they revoked those permissions. Is your app able to handle that change in permissions? Or will it just crash and break everywhere because you just assume that once you got permission, you would always have permission? And you could go on and on and on thinking of all the crazy edge cases and handling them. But again, back to that building that happy path or the golden path of how your users are supposed to use your app, that is like half the battle, right? Once you get that happy path done, now you got to handle the edge cases, right? Because again, if you've ever built an app and handed it to a user and watched them use it, there's a very good chance that they are not going to use it anywhere near the way you want them to use it, or like I said, how they're supposed to use it. Let's finish off the examples with one more that's actually very common, and that is handling empty arrays, right? So for example, let's say we're showing a list of followers on the screen that we got. Well, the happy path is to always expect, hey, there's going to be followers. Well, what if that array is empty? What if the user has no followers? Are you just showing a blank screen? Well, you shouldn't. You should show an empty state saying, hey, this user has no followers, right? So even though an edge case may not crash your app, it may lead to a poor user experience, right? Have you ever used an app, just came to a blank screen, or the app just froze and did nothing at all without telling you anything, right? Like, this bad user experience. So oftentimes handling all these edge cases is more about creating a smooth user experience as the user uses your app, quote unquote, improperly, right? We call it fail gracefully, right? It's impossible to build an app that doesn't fail or doesn't have a situation where it can break. The key here is to fail gracefully in that, like, okay, something bad happened. Now let's handle it right. Give the user an informative error message so they know what's going on and move on, right? That's called failing gracefully. Now, as I mentioned a little earlier, like you can get real crazy thinking of edge cases, but this is where your triage skills come into play, right? You don't have to fix every single edge case, right? Because if there's an edge case that's so crazy and wild that it only affects, 0.1% of your users, like maybe you can spend your resources and your development time on other things rather than fixing all those super crazy 0.1% edge cases, right? Now, if something affects 2 to 5% of your users, of course you want to fix that like right away. And also your size matters, right? So I just said 0.1% of your users. Well, if you have 10, 100,000 users, sure, that's not a large number. If you're Facebook, 0.1% of your users is a very large number. So again, the larger your user base, the more you have to fix those crazy corner cases, because again, that's a lot of people out there. But like I said, what edge cases you actually go fix is a decision you have to make, one, based on your resources, like how much development time do you have, how many users is it affecting, like what percentage. So all that comes into play when choosing which ones to fix and which ones to just live with, right? And that's what's called triage. So thinking of these edge cases not only makes a great product, but it's going to help you in job interviews as well. Often for a job interview, you'll get a take-home project to do, or maybe you're live coding on a whiteboard, or you're on a phone screen where you have to do an hour coding on a computer. You should absolutely be thinking and telling your interviewer, like, okay, this is a potential edge case, or this is how I would handle the array being empty. Thinking of those edge cases is absolutely vital in those interviews because, again, it shows that you're an experienced developer who will think of those things. Oftentimes, it's the very beginner developer that doesn't think of the crazy edge cases, and they only handle the happy path. And then when a user veers off that happy path, things go crazy. So again, the edge cases can help you make a great product as well as help you in interviews. There's a high-level overview of edge cases. I think this could be fun. Feel free to leave some crazy edge cases you've come across in the comments or in the Slack channel. I think it would be kind of fun to just share some weird ways users used your app that led to a crazy edge case that you had to fix. And I think the community at large can benefit from that knowledge as well. Being a software developer, not just an iOS engineer, but just any general software developer, is probably one of the most flexible careers like a person can have. And that's why I love it. You have so many options. And that's what we're going to talk about in this video, right? You can go the big company route. You can go the small startup route. You can go independent contractor or freelancer where you're like a digital nomad. You can work from anywhere. You can build your own products, build your own companies. Like the options are almost endless. So let's talk about those main ones. First up, let's talk about the path of going to a big company, like an Apple, Google. Let's get the obvious stuff out of the way first, right? Like the pay is going to be very good. You're going to have awesome health benefits. You're going to work on a great team. You're going to have the prestige of that name on your resume, which is going to help you, the rest of your career. So a lot of good stuff in going to a big company. There are some downsides. Oftentimes, not every time, but often you will end up specializing in one area. Like the kind of the joke, the exaggeration is like, oh, you'll be the login screen person and that's it. And again, that's not always the case, but you tend to have narrow responsibilities at a big company, right? You specialize. Whereas at a startup, you have to wear a lot of different hats, right? Even though you're a developer, you may be getting into marketing or product and all this stuff, right? You have to do a lot more because there's only, a small number of you. So now let's talk about those small startups, right? They tend to have benefits as well. Now, if it's a super small startup, you may not have benefits, but I would say anything 5 employees and above, you're probably going to have benefits. But the pay is probably average. Oftentimes startups can't compete with those big Google, Apple pay, but the trade-off you get at a startup is you often get equity in the company, right? You get some shares. If the company were ever to get acquired or go public, those shares would theoretically be worth a lot of money if you got in early enough. Now, here's the thing. They call it an exit. For every good exit, again, that's when a company gets acquired or goes public, for every good exit, there's 100 where those startups fail or go out of business, or those shares end up being worthless. So even though getting equity in a company is cool, I consider them to be almost like lottery tickets, right? I don't value them too much because the odds of them hitting are pretty slim. And not only are the odds of them hitting pretty slim, but you also have to be at that company for like 4 or 5 years, which again, nowadays, many people don't stay at a company for that long. So a lot of dominoes have to fall into place for that to work out for you. But I actually prefer small startups to big companies. It's my personal preference, right? Because I like the tight-knit team. Again, I've worked at companies, of 5 people to 25 people and everywhere in that range. And that's just pretty cool, right? It's a tight-knit team. And I like wearing many hats, right? I don't think I would enjoy being a specialist and only programming and working on this one thing. Like, I enjoy being part of the marketing discussions at the startup. I enjoy having input on the product. I enjoy, helping hire a marketing director, right? Like, I like having my hands in things. I don't know. I just find it interesting. That's a personal preference. You may like specializing, but I just want to tell you the difference between going to a big company and a startup. Now let's talk about freelancing, sometimes also called independent contracting. But the idea here is that you're working on a contract basis on, a couple different apps. Maybe you have one contract that's a big one. Maybe you have a couple small ones. But the benefits here is just flexibility and freedom. You get to you work remotely, right? You heard the concept of a digital nomad where people just travel the world working remotely on contracts out of coffee shops. Like, that sounds like a pretty fun life. Or you can just work from home. That works too. But the reason people like this is because there's no commute. They make their own schedule. You have a lot of freedom. But with a lot of freedom comes some downside and responsibility. So contracting is great, but the hardest part about it is getting a consistent stream of contracts, right? Because if your contracts are up, you're not getting paid. You go on vacation, you're not getting paid. It's just a different lifestyle. For example, when I was contracting earlier in my career, I had another contract lined up, but it wasn't starting for 4 weeks. So I couldn't really line anything up to fit in that 4 weeks. So I just went without getting paid for 4 weeks. And that's not uncommon for contractors. So if you like that freelancing lifestyle, if that sounds awesome, traveling the world, I know it does, but it's hard. Not gonna lie, it's hard. And my recommendation, because they call it feast or famine, you'll have some periods of time where you're making so much money, and then you'll have other periods of times where you can't find a contract and you're making no money. So the recommendation is, if you want to try that freelancing, I would recommend working at a company first, knowing you have a plan to freelance, and start building up some savings, right? Because you need an emergency fund if you're going to be a contractor. And then also, while you're working full time, you can maybe start lining up contracts on the side, maybe start building connections, because in contracting, your network is extremely valuable. That's how I get all my contracts, right? My personal and professional network, word of mouth, the YouTube channel helps, but it's never going to Upwork or some internet site and finding contracts. So again, if you're thinking about freelancing, work at a company, start building up your network, maybe find a small contract or two, build up a nest egg of money, and then make the leap. Trust me, you'll thank me for that advice later. Now let's talking about building your own thing, because this is kind of the most vague, the most flexible, but it's great if you're entrepreneurial and you want to, create your own startup. One of the biggest problems startups have is finding technical people, finding developers that are good. So if you can just eliminate that problem by you being the developer, you have so much freedom. And again, if you have an idea, build it. It's almost like a superpower being a developer, right? And you don't even have to go as far as building your own startups. Maybe you can just build your own portfolio of independent apps. And then over time, those 10 apps are making enough money for your living, right? It's just, again, this career path is so flexible. Big company, startup, freelancing, building your own thing. I just love it. I'm so happy you're on this path, and I hope that I can help you get your start, because it's a wonderful life, not gonna lie. In this section, we're going to talk about the world of iOS development, some of the resources that I use to this day to continue my learning, and then some of the resources I used back when I first got my start. Now, I know this section isn't teaching you how to code directly, but in my opinion, it is still insanely valuable. Because again, the whole point of this course was to set you up for success, right? I want you to use this foundation to continue your journey, continue building upon it towards a successful career. You've probably heard the phrase, give somebody a fish and they eat for a day. Teach somebody how to fish and they eat for a lifetime. Well, I'm trying to teach you how to fish, and that's what this section does. We'll cover a bunch of different blogs and websites that I visit on a regular basis to keep my knowledge up to date. I'll show you how to use Twitter most effectively. Yeah, I said Twitter. Believe it or not, as a developer, Twitter might be the most valuable tool you have when it comes to learning and networking, getting jobs, getting that interview. Twitter is insanely powerful, and I know it kind of gets a bad rap, all the political and bullying stuff, but developer Twitter is amazing. And we'll also cover a bunch of recommended books, recommended podcasts you should be listening to, because I believe in complete immersion when you're learning this stuff. And the more you immerse yourself in this world, the better you're going to learn it and the faster you're going to learn it. And then we'll also talk about WWDC and what that is. If you're not familiar, that's the Worldwide Developers Conference that Apple puts on every year in June. And we'll talk about why it's the best time of year for iOS developers. It's like Christmas, and if you don't celebrate Christmas, whatever happy time of the year you celebrate, it's better than that for iOS developers, and we'll talk about all that. So onward with this valuable section, and I hope by the end of it, you at least know how to fish a little bit. Let's talk about my favorite time of year. Like, I literally take the week off of work for it, and that is WWDC, which stands for Worldwide Developers Conference. And what that is Apple's big conference that they put on every year, usually the first week of June, where they announce all the new stuff, the new toys for developers, right? This is where you get your first sneak peek at the new iOS, right? Like coming up in 2020, it'll be iOS 14, all the new stuff in macOS, etc. As developers, you'll be able to download the beta to put it on your phone to play with all the new stuff. You'll see all the new frameworks coming out. Like, for example, Swift itself was announced, a surprise announcement, at WWDC back in 2014. Swift UI, surprise announcement, 2019 WWDC. So this is when all the big stuff happens. It's the best time of year for iOS developers. Now, the great thing is you can experience this in two ways. One, if you're lucky enough to go, which is like $1,600, at least as of 2019, for a ticket, and you have to win a lottery to even go. It's a super expensive trip. But if you live in the area or you can make it and you have the money, I would recommend going, as it is a great time, right? iOS developers from all over the world converge onto San Jose, California. And it's also a great place to meet developers you may have been networking with on Twitter or content creators you like another weird flex, I know, but I took probably 100 plus selfies at WWDC 2019. It's just a cool place to go actually meet people that you've interacted on Twitter with all year, right? Because everybody just, descends on this area. But of course, going to California, getting that $1,600 ticket, that is expensive. Totally get it. The bright side is that Apple live streams every single session. And a session is like when they're introducing a new topic. Like, for example, when they introduced Swift, that was a session. And they always do a what's new in Swift, where they talk about the new stuff coming out. There's over 100 sessions, usually about a half hour to an hour long, and they're all available through the Apple Developer app that you can watch on your Apple TV, on your phone, on your iPad. So literally, the whole month of June, I'm just watching WWDC sessions, not watching any TV, just catching up on DubDub. So like I said, even if you can't make it in person, you can still experience it, because also, aside from watching all the sessions, Twitter is just a buzz. iOS dev Twitter is a party during that time. Everybody's tweeting out stuff. They're playing with the new frameworks, playing with the new toys, tweeting out their opinion on the new features. It's just an awesome time of year as an iOS developer. And it's funny, every year I try to say, I'm going to watch every session because I get so pumped. I usually end up watching about 30 to 40 of the sessions, but it's literally like whatever your favorite TV show ever is, it'd be like if they just dropped 4 seasons on Netflix and you just get to binge it, right? That's pretty much what it's like. Now let's talk about the betas. I know I touched on it a little bit before, but there's betas for iPadOS, iOS, macOS, watchOS. Basically every platform Apple has, they release the betas. And it's not wise to go download the betas on what we call your daily driver. That means the phone you use every day, the one you need, because betas are buggy, betas will crash all the time, especially a macOS beta. Maybe some programs you need won't work on the new beta. So don't download the beta unless you have a spare device that you can put it on to test things out. But the whole purpose of these betas, even though I think most people use it just to play around with the new toys before the general public gets to, is that it's to help developers get their apps ready for the new iOS release. For example, this September 2020, iOS 14 will be released. We don't know anything about it yet, but if there's big features, developers have to get their apps ready, so when it's officially launched in September, their apps are ready to go. So what happens is developers update their apps from June to September on the betas. They get all the new features ready. That way, again, when the new iPhone event that happens in late September and iOS 14 launches, their app is all updated, ready to go on day one. Now, this course is coming out in March of 2020. So if you're watching this right away, WWDC 2020 comes in June, so it's right around the corner. So let's talk about how you can learn as a brand new iOS developer. Now here's the thing, not gonna lie, it is going to be overwhelming for a new iOS developer. I remember my first WWDC, which was 2015. I was excited, I got caught up in it, but when watching the sessions and trying to follow on Twitter, reading the blog posts, hearing people's opinions, I had no idea what they were talking about. Like, I maybe understood 5 to 10% of it, the other 90% right over my head. That's fine. Like, I still am glad that I did that because that exposed me to everything. I was able to immerse myself. Even if I didn't get it, I was still hearing the terms. I was still, learning about, things that existed. Even if I didn't understand how it worked, I still knew it existed. And over time, as you're hearing this stuff, it starts to like sink in over time. But again, you got to immerse yourself. So even if you feel intimidated your very first year of WWDC, I would still watch it, still go through it. And again, I didn't understand almost any of it. But the good thing is that gets better. Like my next WWDC, I understood maybe 30 to 40% of it. And then by the third year, I was like all in. I obviously don't understand everything because they're talking about, frameworks and APIs that you never use. But like I understood the lingo. When they put code up on the screen, I knew exactly what was going on. It gets better and easier. And then again, by your second or third year, like Dub is going to be your favorite time of year. It's going to be awesome. It's just, you can tell I'm excited just talking about it. So in this video, I just wanted to let you know what WWDC was, why it's so exciting, how you can learn from it. And like I said, the keynote is kind of like the highlight of the event. That's what kicks everything off. It's like a 2-hour long keynote and they're showing off all the big picture features. Like, to be honest with you, like the keynote can be watched by like non-developers because it's really like, here's the new features in iOS 14. However, every other video is basically for developers. But yeah, just like try following along Twitter during the keynote. It's going too fast to even keep up with, but it's so much fun. So if WWDC 2020 is going to be your first one, we're going to be in Slack. We have a Slack group for this course. I'm sure everybody in Slack is going to be talking about it. It's just a fun community event. Again, it's the best time of year. So I hope you enjoy your first WWDC. If Twitter isn't the most valuable thing in my developer career, it's definitely in the top 3. And that surprises so many new developers. And I know Twitter gets a bad rap, all the politics, bullying, cancel culture. Like, I get it. Twitter can be bad. But the thing about Twitter is you kind of control what you see, right? Like based on who you follow, like that's what you're going to see. So if you focus a Twitter account, and I've even seen people do this, right? They have their personal Twitter account for all their hobbies or whatever they're into. And then they create a special developer account. And that's like their professional account where all they do is follow developers. That's how they interact with the developer community, etc. So like I said, I kind of get why you may have reservations about joining Twitter, but I'm here to tell you in this video, it's insanely valuable for developers. And that's because developers pretty much live on Twitter, like almost too much. But the point is like that's where everybody hangs out in the developer community. Now, the first benefit of Twitter I want to talk about is networking. It is probably the #1 way to network in a developer community, right? Of course, you can go to conferences, go to local meetups, but that's a small number of people, whereas Twitter is like the whole industry. Let me share a quick story about something that can only happen on Twitter, right? I have another course out called the iOS Take-Home Project course where we implement a collection view and we use this new thing in iOS 13 called Diffable Data Source. Well, I'm talking about it on Twitter. I'm sharing my work. I'm retweeting other students, tweeting stuff out. And an engineer named Steve Breen, liked the tweet, retweeted the tweet, started following me. And if you look into who Steve Breen is, he's an Apple engineer working on the UI collection view team who actually helped build the Diffable Data Source stuff. And actually, if you watch the WWDC video on Diffable Data Source, he's the one up there presenting, introducing this to the world. So now Steve knows about my work, we follow each other on Twitter, we can now interact, and that kind of stuff can only happen on Twitter. So back to networking, right? Again, Twitter is like the #1 way to network as a developer. Now, when you're networking, keep in mind that networking is a long-term investment, right? This is going to be something that pays off and you build over years. But that's okay. You plan on being an iOS developer for years, right? And because you're building that over your entire career, yes, you may want to try to network with those Apple engineers or those more senior engineers, but don't forget to network with your peers right now, other developers just learning like you. Again, another story. I did my iOS Developer Bootcamp in 2015, so that's 5 years ago now, and my peers there were just a bunch of students who didn't even really know how to program. Now, 2 of those graduates are engineers at Apple. Another went on to work at Coinbase and built the native Coinbase app during the 2017, crypto boom. My point is your peers right now in 3 to 5 years are going to go on to do great things. So if you're building those relationships now and let those build over 5 years, when it comes time to get Probably not that first job, right? Because they may not be able to help you right away. But, 3, 4, 5 years into your career, when you're ready to go work at a big company, Facebook, Instagram, Apple, Google, YouTube, whatever, now it's very likely that you're going to have contacts and relationships with people on those teams. Now you may be wondering well, how do I network on Twitter? We're going to get into finding people to follow later in the video, but at the end of the day, Twitter is just a conversation, right? So if you follow people and you see them talking about something, join the conversation. Don't just pop in with a thumbs up emoji, but actually have something intelligent to say. Or another way is to interact with content creators' content. And that kind of leads me to another reason why Twitter is so valuable. If you follow all the YouTubers, the bloggers, the podcasters, right? They're constantly putting out awesome Swift iOS developer learning material. And how do they share that material? They put it out on Twitter. So if you're following all those people, your feed is going to be a constant influx of new blog posts to read, new podcasts to listen to, new YouTube videos to watch. You're going to constantly get knowledge presented right in front of you. So it's a great way to learn as well. And that content presents two opportunities for you to network. One is with the content creator itself. Content creators in this space typically have the big ones, 20 to 30,000 Twitter followers. It may sound like a lot, but as somebody with almost 20,000 myself, weird flex, I know. You're going to get noticed, right? If you retweet my stuff and retweet with a comment, or you're always liking, you're always commenting on my tweets, I'm not big enough to not notice you, right? So nobody in the iOS space is too big to not notice you. So interact with the content, actually read someone's blog post after they tweet it and say, hey, thanks for the blog post. I really liked what you said about this. It really helped a lot. Thanks. That means a ton for the content creators. And if you're constantly supporting them, constantly retweeting their stuff, constantly commenting, they're gonna know who you are. And again, that's just networking. It's a two-way street, right? The content creator gave you valuable content, helped you learn. You help them out by sharing their stuff and interacting and engaging with their content. That's how networking works. It's a two-way street. Now you may be thinking, well, what good does a retweet do if I have 7 followers, right? I get that. That's the power of hashtags come in. So still retweet it, maybe retweet it with a comment on it, and then make sure you use hashtag iOSDev or hashtag SwiftSlang. Those are the hashtags that people search in this community. So even if you have no followers, when you put the hashtags on there, that content can still get discovered and you're helping the content creator share. And again, this is not about, hey, you should help content creators. Again, this is about networking to the point where you can build a relationship with that content creator. Because I can tell you firsthand, I know developers and have built relationships with developers because they've been sharing my stuff for years now. And I'll tell you what, if they ever asked me for a favor or needed help for something or needed a recommendation for a job, I would go way above and beyond for them because they have been supporting my work for years. Again, it's a two-way street. So back to the benefits of networking. Remember, I want to stress this. This is a long-term investment, right? You can't just reply to a couple tweets and then in a month later be like, networking doesn't work, right? I didn't get a job from it. That's not how it goes. This is going to pay off 1, 2, 3, 4 years down the road. Again, if you've done networking correctly after 3, 4 years, you're going to have contacts at basically every major tech company out there. That's how I used it, right? I built up my network and my contacts mostly through my YouTube channel. But when it came time for me to start interviewing at big companies, I didn't go to the website and apply, right? I didn't go to lyft.com/jobs and fill out an application. I went to Twitter, went to my contacts, said, hey, so-and-so, I'm interested in interviewing at Lyft. I'm just using Lyft as an example. Would you mind passing on my resume? After you've built that relationship over a couple years, they're going to be more than happy to do it. And you're doing it that way, pretty much get you a guaranteed interview. Now, of course, once you're in the interview, it's up to you to perform, but that's how, once you've built a network, you can pretty much get an interview at any company, as long as they have an opening. So that's where the value comes in. And again, that doesn't pay off till 1, 2, 3, 4 years down the road. So let's talk about some ways not to network, right? So definitely get in there and ask questions. Feel free to tag one person and ask questions, but you need to be courteous of that person's time. And I'm speaking firsthand, right? I get this all the time. A lot of times people will tag me and then they'll just copy and paste a huge view controller. Hey, Sean, can you fix my bug? That's not how you do it. But if you ask me a question on Twitter and you tag me and it's something I can answer off the top of my head in 5 minutes, I'm happy to give you a valuable, insightful response. Career related questions, maybe how to solve a simple problem if you're stuck. That's how you do it. Again, so when you're asking a question on Twitter, be respectful of their time and think, okay, how long is it going to take them to answer this? And if it's short, go for it. If you got to copy and paste code and they got to read it and try to fix your bug, that's not how you do it. Another thing you don't do is don't ask your question and tag 10 people, right? I see that all the time. Somebody will have a question and they'll tag all the top content creators in the iOS space. All that does is that just spams that person's mentions as people are replying to that, right? So that's just not a good look. That's more you're annoying who you're trying to get help from, and that's never a good thing. Now let's talk about like who to follow. Well, first of all, down in the description of this video, I'm going to list a handful of must follow Twitter accounts in the iOS dev space, but you're going to need to follow more than that. And there's two main ways to do that. One is to see who those people are following. For example, if you go to my account, you can see who I'm following. Go down that list and follow the developers you find interesting. Now you're gonna have to sift through some like sports stuff, some comedy stuff, some crypto stuff, but it is mostly developers. And then follow the ones you like, and then repeat that with other developers. See who they're following, so you can quickly build up your list. Now here's the trick though. When you quickly build up your list like this, not all developers like to tweet about developer stuff, right? Sometimes you may follow a developer and you may find 90% of the stuff they tweet is stuff you don't care about and 10% is developer stuff. Well, you don't have to keep following them. So I guess what I'm trying to say is this is probably going to be a process. You'll end up following a bunch of developers and then you may end up having to unfollow stuff to like just prune your list so you get the good content that you want. Another great way to find followers is to follow events. For example, WWDC 2020 is coming up in June, if the coronavirus doesn't cancel it, but that'll be an event that all iOS developers are following. They're going to be a hashtag WWDC20. And if you follow that hashtag, you'll see all kinds of developers tweeting and commenting about what's going on in WWDC. That is another great way to find developers in the space. So that's some ways to find people to follow. And again, I'm going to have a list to get you started in the description. But again, I can't stress enough, Twitter is probably the most valuable tool. It's a great way to build relationships with other developers. You can find help on your questions. You can potentially get jobs because you're going to know a lot of people at all the big tech companies. It's so valuable. And you're going to learn a lot. Again, all the content creators, sharing and pushing the content that they're, putting out there, the iOS dev knowledge. So it is insanely valuable. I understand you may have reservations about joining Twitter because it does get a bad rap, but if you use it correctly, because again, you control who you follow, you control what's on your feed. And if you follow somebody that's constantly retweeting political stuff you don't like or bullying stuff you don't like just unfollow them or block them, whatever. Like you control what you see. So if you stick to just the developer stuff, Twitter is amazing. I can't recommend it enough. And hopefully this video helped you out. The first website I want to share is Swift by Sundell by John Sundell. Now, John is a very prominent name in the iOS Swift space, so his articles are always high quality. Now, admittedly, some of his articles, and he does them weekly, by the way, usually on Sunday, but some of them may be a little too advanced for the absolute beginner or somebody just beginning their journey. Those are his regular articles that come out on Sunday. However, I still wanted to share this because one, you're going to grow to look forward to these articles as you gain more experience, but he also has a basics section, as you see here, where he has, again, great high quality articles on some of the basic Swift and iOS developer concepts, optionals, access control, enums, closures. That's always a tricky one, right? Introduction to Swift UI, strings, generics. So definitely check out his basics articles, and then as you gain more experience, you'll start to appreciate the weekly articles more. John also has a great podcast, probably one of the best in the space. We'll get to that in the podcast video though. Next up, we have Hacking with Swift by Paul Hudson. If you're not familiar with Paul, @2straws on Twitter, follow him. He is a content creation machine. He's got books, podcasts, articles, videos, definitely a vital resource for the Swift community. And the great thing about Paul is that he prides himself on keeping everything absolutely up to date, right? Like as soon as Swift 5.1 came out, all his articles were updated for Swift 5.1. So if you're Googling and you come across a Hacking with Swift, solution to your problem, you can bet your bottom dollar that it is going to be the latest and greatest. It's not going to be out of date, which can be a problem if you find something on Stack Overflow. Now, I could spend probably a half hour reviewing all the stuff he has on this website, but I'll leave that for you to explore. I'll share some highlights that I think are valuable for the beginners out there. And let's go to Learn tab up here at the top. And he has these two concepts, 100 days of Swift. So this is one Swift lesson a day for 100 days for you to continue practicing your Swift. And he goes through the rules of the course. You can see the whole curriculum here. Again, I don't want to spend too much time on it, but he also has 100 days of Swift UI. So if you want to dive into the Swift UI, Same concept, one SwiftUI lesson per day for 100 days, and there's a whole hashtag around it so you can follow along other people doing it as well. So if you're interested in that sort of like learning progression and practice, highly recommend this. Now, admittedly, I rarely just come to the site and surf around. I usually get to the site via a Twitter post, or most likely, and how I find the site most valuable is a Google search. So take a common thing, right? How to shuffle an array in Swift. How to shuffle an array Swift, right? And you search for it. You're going to get, some Stack Overflow questions, but I always look for the Hacking with Swift article. You can see I've already kind of clicked on this one. And because you're going to get, this is up to date. Like I said, a Stack Overflow article, maybe back in Swift 3, it may be out of date, but you're going to get an up-to-date answer, and it's always so concise. And this conciseness is amazing for somebody who has a couple years of experience in iOS development. You can just get right to the point. However, if you're just a beginner, maybe you might want to look for something that gives more of an explanation. Don't get me wrong, this .shuffle and .shuffled, very straightforward, but some of the more complex things, he's still concise, which again, I love and appreciate. But if you're just beginning, I think you'll find yourself just copying and pasting to get it working. And Paul does offer, you can see all the books here on the right. He offers the content to teach you that deep learning, but just be careful of just copy, paste, it works. Okay, you always want to know what your code is doing. All right, let's move on to RayWunderlich.com, another insanely valuable site for the iOS developer community. In fact, this is how I learned, right? Back in 2015, I pretty much lived on this site. So I can kind of personally vouch for this. This is how I learned. Of course, the site has changed a lot in the past 5 years, but I definitely enjoyed my learning on this site. Now, this site is all about videos. It is a subscription. It does cost. Let's go to the store, right? I don't want to find your subscription plan here. So it's either $19 a month or $14.99 if you buy it annually. So $15 to $20 a month to invest in your iOS learning. But again, if we go back, the amount of videos they have is just insane on all these iOS topics, right? Beginning ARKit, data structures and algorithms in Swift, Swift UI, what's new in Xcode 11, the workflow. And there's a whole getting started with iOS section. So they do have a beginner. And there's even, if you click on paths, right? We want to pick iOS and Swift for beginners, not Android and Kotlin. Come on. So start path. And you can see there's even a nice path of courses that they have for you to start your iOS developer journey, and continue this. Now, to be honest, most of this beginner stuff we've already covered in this course, but not all of it, right? You see collection views. We didn't do that. Animations. We didn't do all that. So this still can propel your learning. And like I said, that's just their beginner path. But even after you're not a beginner anymore and, you want to learn some advanced topics like machine learning for iOS, as you see here, push notifications, just an insane resource. Again, yes, it is $20 a month or $15 if you buy the annual, but in my opinion, that's a small investment into your learning to make this a career. And again, this is how I learned. I spent that $20 a month for about a year and just lived on this site. So I enjoyed it. Moving on, we have Swiftly by Antoine van der Lee. He just posts a lot of basically all skill levels from beginner to advanced. So he's also a good follow on Twitter. Give him a follow. That's how I discover his articles. He puts it out on Twitter. I always check him out. You're definitely going to learn a lot with his articles. I could scroll here, but it's basically just a myriad of topics. Again, all the way from beginner to advanced, but definitely a must follow and definitely a must bookmark. Same thing with Donnie Walls here. Relative newcomer on the scene, if you will, probably for the past year he's been putting out content, but he's an iOS developer at Disney, and he, again, same thing, kind of similar to Antoine van der Lee. Not that they put out the same content, but he posts a variety of beginner to advanced stuff. But if we go to the blog, you can see some of the topics. These are probably more advanced stuff than you're looking for. But back down here, you see some relatively simple stuff, right? Like how to sort an array based on a property, how to add an element to the start of an array. So he does do some beginner stuff. But again, a lot of these resources that I'm showing you aren't necessarily just beginner resources, right? Like I said, this is the stuff that I use and learn to this day. So you may have to grow into these resources a little bit, but you're definitely going to want to follow them. Next up, let's talk about iOS Dev Weekly by Dave Verwer. So iOS Dev Weekly is a newsletter. However, you can come to the website here and see the newsletter. He shares a bunch of great links. It comes out every Friday. I recommend signing up for the newsletter so it gets delivered right to your email. This is the premier newsletter in iOS developer world. Like, if you're an iOS developer, you got to subscribe to this newsletter. Just enough said. And let's finish up with some Swift UI focused stuff. Remember, like I said, the bulk of this course does focus on UIKit, but I still want to expose you to Swift UI, even though it's still super early in Swift UI. I can't emphasize that enough, but there are some blogs and websites that are popping up that are dedicated to Swift UI. One, for example, here is the Swift UI Lab. And let's go to articles here. And I like these articles because they're very visual. We'll scroll down to one that I checked out here a little bit ago just to make sure. So like advanced Swift UI transitions, right? So this is the topic of Swift UI transitions, but you can see his articles also have like animated GIFs to show you what you're building. So you can see this is transitioning, looks like a button here, all the different transitions. I'll let the screen play. You can see sliding to the right, fading in, fading out. So their articles are very visual, which is what I like about it. So definitely if you want to dive more into Swift UI, bookmark the Swift UI Lab. And then also you have Majid's blog here to finish up here. Much more simple looking, but this is also super dedicated to Swift UI. For example, just the latest one on February 19th, mastering buttons in Swift UI. Click on that. This is basically just how to use buttons in Swift UI. And again, very visual, showing you what you're building. So big fan of that. That wraps up the blogs and websites that I visit on a regular basis to continue my learning and that I think you should bookmark. Of course, there are a ton more websites out there. I'm not saying this is like the only list. So if you have a website that you love, that you think is a valuable resource, definitely leave it in the comment section. I would love for the comments of this video to just be a great resource of links for other people to check out that are also learning as well. But again, bookmark these websites, check them on a regular basis, and we'll see you in the next video. In this video, I'm going to give you a bunch of book recommendations for you to continue on your learning. Two quick disclaimers. It's impossible for me to cover every possible book out there. So if you have a great book that you really like that I didn't list, please leave it in the comments. And again, if you're watching this video, make sure you check out the comments for further suggestions. And there will be links to all these in the description of the video, but I want to be completely transparent. A lot of them will be affiliate links. And that's just because like, I have relationships with like everybody in the space. So I'm not trying to point you only to my affiliate links. That's not it at all. If you ask 10 developers, they're probably going to give you a list very similar to mine, but I do want to be upfront and honest about that. All right, on to my recommendations. First up is the site that I used the most to learn back in 2015 when I was getting started, and that is raywunderlich.com. Now we're going to scroll down. This is the video subscription service. You can do that if you like, but we're talking about books here, right? So I'm going to slowly scroll down. You can see iOS Apprentice teaches you everything just about iOS, essentially. You see machine learning, mastering Git. I'm not going to list all of them. The point is, as I scroll, I'll talk. You can see there are a ton of topics. So he's got like 50 different books on everything. Animations, core data, push notifications, right? There's just, the list is so long. So Ray Wenderlich has a very vast library for pretty much any topic you may want to tackle in the iOS development space. And again, Ray Wenderlich is how I got my start, so I can kind of personally vouch for, you know, the quality. And it is one of the biggest names in the space. So definitely check it out if you're interested. Next up, we have Hacking with Swift by Paul Hudson. You may start to see these names repeat a lot because again, there's a lot of big names in the space that create a ton of content, but very similar to Ray Wenderlich, Paul has a book on almost every topic, right? Hacking with iOS, just the basics iOS, Swift in 60 seconds, Pro Swift, design patterns, testing, Swift UI, right? Again, I'm not going to like list everything, but you can scroll down and see all the books here. And I think really at the end of the day, right, like there's a lot of great teachers out there, but what teaching style, what writing style resonates with you the most, that's whose books you should go to. So again, I know I'm kind of showing a lot of the same topics, but again, you're going to see different teaching styles and you may resonate more with different teaching styles. Next up, we have the Human Interface Guidelines. Now, this isn't like a Swift tutorial book like Ray Wenderlich or Hacking with Swift, but this is directly from Apple, basically telling you the best practices for their platforms. Like you have macOS, watchOS, tvOS. Let's click into iOS to show you some things here. So it's basically going to tell you how to properly design and use best practices in your app. So over here on the left, you can see we have like app architecture, onboarding, like how that should work. And it's going to tell you, again, the best practices. Like for example, this blue button here, like it'll tell you every touch target should be at least 44 points tall, because again, that's the size of the average human fingertip, right? So it's stuff like that, right? A modality, right? It'll tell you how to properly create your modal sheets coming up. So I think this is just a must read for all iOS developers because it's going to tell you all the best practices on building iOS apps straight from Apple. And again, more things. Let's go to the user interaction section, right? Drag and drop. You know, it'll tell you again the best practices on using drag and drop. It'll usually have videos to show you, how to do it. I mean, it's not going to show you like a tutorial on how to do it, but it's going to show you the best practices on how to implement it on the iOS platform, right? That way your iOS app feels like an iOS app and not some just random concoction you came up with. And the reason that's important is because iOS users expect a certain, way of doing things. And if every single app on iOS had all kinds of different navigation, all different ways of doing things, like it would be a bad user experience, right? But when users use an iOS app, they kind of intuitively already know how to use it based on the best practices Apple has set forward. So if you want to learn more about those best practices, again, human interface guidelines, they update it constantly. For example, they just came out with a new update all about, Siri and how to implement that. So it's always updated. I always recommend iOS developers read through this at least once a year. Anyway, it's great stuff. It's a must read. Next up, we have a little bit of a shameless plug, and that is my own book called It's Only Crazy Until You Do It, How I Became an iOS Developer. And it tells my story because my story isn't the normal path, right? I went into the Navy right after high school. I was an insurance agent for 6 years. I went back to school at 30. I didn't really know what I wanted to do in my 20s. And then I wrote my first line of code at 32. And just kind of fell in love with development. And it tells the story, how that happened, how I learned to code, how I ended up getting my first job, and basically how I launched my career. And my goal for the book was for people exactly in your spot that are just learning to kind of be inspirational, right? Because, maybe some of you out there are a little older. Maybe you're not the 22-year-old kid, right? So hopefully it'll be inspirational to you to just tell you my story. And again, it's only like 60 pages, short little ebook that you can probably knock out in a couple days, but I've been told it's very inspirational, and that was my goal. Next up, if you want to dive into SwiftUI, we have some book by Mark Moykins, another YouTuber. He's created 2 SwiftUI books called SwiftUI Views Mastery and then SwiftUI Animations. Both of these, what I like about them is they're extremely visual. And I'm actually diving into SwiftUI myself, building a couple apps in it, really starting to learn it. And I've been using Mark's book myself. And like I said, they're page turners, I call it, because they're so visual. Like I always want to turn the page because I want to see what's on the next page. And it's not like a typical book, as you can see here, where you just have to read paragraphs and paragraphs. Like it's really short, quick, bite-sized stuff. And that's what I like about it. And then again, the visuals to actually show you what the code is doing, it's great stuff. So, of course, Ray Wenderlich, Hacking with Swift, they all had books as well, but I like Mark's because it's very, very visual. And then finally, we have the official Swift programming language book from Apple that's free to download. A lot of people will say start by reading this book. I actually disagree with that because I did that. I started. And as somebody who started with Swift, I had never coded before. This was all new. That book was just super overwhelming to me because it's very code heavy. You're just reading a lot of code. So while I do think this book is great once you have some knowledge behind you, I think it can be almost discouraging as the first thing you read to learn. So I definitely recommend reading this book, but I would come back to it once you've got a little bit of baseline knowledge under your belt. And even then, because this book gets into some of the advanced topics, the advanced topics may still be over your head, but this is also a book that you should probably read every year or two. Because again, this is constantly updated with every new version of Swift. So as new things come out, Swift changes. So that's my initial, kind of group of books. If you're interested in, taking this even further, like I said, it was impossible for me to hit every single book. I know there's going to be some great recommendations in the comments. So please, if I missed one, if you have one, leave it down there. And again, if you're watching, don't skip over the comments. Be sure to check those out. All right, see you in the next video. Now let's talk about iOS Developer Podcast. If you're already a podcast fan, you understand how valuable and useful they can be. If you haven't fallen in love with podcasts yet, or you don't really listen to them, I would actually recommend starting because they're just great on commutes or going for walks. It's great multitasking because you can be learning while you're driving to work or while you're walking the dog. It's great. So I'm to the point where I listen to music 15% of the time. The other 85% of the time I have my AirPods in, it's a podcast. I just love them so much. And part of learning iOS development, I believe in complete immersion. So if you're just learning, always throwing on an iOS developer podcast while you're driving to work or walking the dog, it's just going to help you out a lot. So let's start with some podcasts that you should be listening to. Let's just get this out of the way right away. The shameless plug, my own podcast called iOS Dev Discussions. I do a myriad of things. I think what most people like is I do a show called Origin Stories, where I have, developers, both well-known and not so well-known on the show. And we talk about how they got their start. How did they learn to code in the first place? Were they a child? Were they as an adult? Was it via school? What was it that made them want to learn to code? How they went about learning, how they got their very first iOS developer job. Again, it's their origin story, and a lot of people seem to like those. And branching off of origin stories, I created another show called The Journey, where I bring on people that are just learning. And the point of that show is to share other people's journey, what they're struggling with, how they're learning, what they're doing to become an iOS developer. And again, hopefully sharing that story, that information inspires others that are just learning as well. And then lastly, for my podcast, sometimes I'll pop on for a quick 10 to 15 minute episode. I don't know, just talking about random topics that come to my head, of course, that have to do with iOS development and being a developer. Next up, we have Swift by Sandel, which is probably the most listened to podcast in the space. Like the numbers aren't public, but I would assume that. This comes out every 2 weeks, and he has a different guest on. Sometimes it's Apple employees, sometimes it's other well-known developers. What I like about this show is that he caters the topic of the episode to that guest. For example, when I was on the show, we talked about content creation, teaching, sharing your work, all that stuff, because that's, my strength. That's what I do. However, when he brings on somebody who is very focused in, let's say, machine learning, that episode is all about machine learning. So the topics are always different based on who the guest is. And that's why I like it. And it comes out, again, every 2 weeks. And like I said, it's probably the most popular podcast in the space. So definitely give it a listen. Next up, we have Swift Over Coffee with Paul Hudson and Erica Sadoun. And I don't think you can find two more knowledgeable people on Swift coming together to create a podcast. So again, another must listen. It comes out every 2 weeks as well. And they break the show down into, they do a news section, a pick section where both Paul and Erica will kind of pick something they want to talk about. And then they do an open ballot section where on Twitter, they'll put out open questions and you can actually interact with the show. It's kind of like the fan interaction, if you will, asking your Swift questions to, again, two of the most knowledgeable people in the space. Up next, we have Fireside Swift with Steve Berard and Zach Falgo. This is a unique podcast because it's very casual, laid back. Don't get me wrong, you're still talking about hardcore Swift and iOS developer concepts, but if you just want like a laid back, funny conversation where they're cracking jokes, having a good time, this is the podcast for you. Moving on, we have Swift Unwrapped by JP Smart of Lyft and Jesse Squires. This is a more advanced podcast, we'll say, because they follow Swift evolution. If you're not familiar, Swift is open source, and how they bring in new features into Swift is called the Swift evolution process, where everything happens out in the open, and they talk about new features coming into Swift. So this is very language level development, type podcast, and talking about the new upcoming features of Swift. And what I like about it is sometimes they'll even have the Apple engineers on the Swift core team come on the show to explain, why they're implementing these features and kind of the thought process behind all that, which is fascinating stuff. So again, while this is maybe more of an advanced podcast, for those, again, this is a beginner course, I still recommend putting it on your radar and maybe even listening to it, just to, again, absorb it, expose yourself to it. But don't be discouraged if 90% of it goes over your head. Even now, me 5 years into my career, I would say half of it goes over my head. So it is more advanced, but I still think it's great because, again, what they talk about and who they bring on. And this comes out whenever. I don't think they're on a regular schedule, but definitely subscribe to it and you'll see it pop up in your feed. Next up, we have Stack Trace from John Sandel and Guy Rambo. Again, John Sandel's other podcast, but this is life and technology from a developer's perspective. That's their new tagline. But it's just a great conversation between two very knowledgeable and experienced developers about news, maybe new Apple products coming out and how that's going to affect developers, or a new framework that's coming out. For example, they're talking a lot about Swift UI lately and their experiences in learning Swift UI and trying to figure out what is the best architecture. Because again, Swift UI is so new that we're still trying to figure out best practices as a community. And they talk about all that kind of stuff. At the end of the day, it's just a good conversation between two knowledgeable and experienced developers. And finally, we have the Swift Community Podcast, which is it's a podcast for the community, by the community. It's kind of it's an interesting concept that it's an open sourced podcast, right? You can submit a topic for an episode, even recommend being the host of the episode by submitting a pull request into their GitHub repo. Everything is done on the GitHub repo, talking about lining up guests, what topics they're going to do, who's going to edit the show. It's all open source, right? It's not just one or two people that run this podcast. So it's a unique concept. Still trying to figure it out. It's still early. It's only been around for a little bit, but it does come out sporadically because, again, it's kind of open source, so there's no set schedule. But definitely check out the repo, and if you're interested in kind of breaking into the podcast space, maybe give it a shot. So those are the main podcasts I listen to. Of course, that's not all of them. There's way too many to list. So as usual, if you have a great podcast that you think other students will like, leave it in the comments. And again, if you're watching, don't skip over the comments. I'm sure there's great recommendations down there. See you in the next video. You just got a lot thrown at you, right? I get it. That was nearly 60 videos of just information. So it is perfectly normal to be feeling a little bit overwhelmed right now and feeling like you don't quite get it. But think about it. You're learning an entire new skill, an entire new profession, and you're just at the beginning, right? You don't watch just a few hours of videos and then now you're good to go, right? This takes time, like I keep saying. And like I said, if you feel overwhelmed, perfectly normal. I mean, I remember like when I was doing my boot camp, I felt insanely overwhelmed. It was like drinking through a fire hose. Like I just was trying to keep my head above water. And to be perfectly honest with you, like I started questioning myself and wondering like, did I make a mistake trying to do this? Like, am I even cut out for this? And I'm so glad that I battled through those feelings. Because again, once you get through that, you're good to go. But we've all dealt with these feelings. So don't worry too much if you're, feeling overwhelmed or feeling like, oh man, I'm never going to get this stuff. Yes, you will. It'll just take time. And that's my biggest piece of advice kind of leaving this course is to be patient with yourself and stick with it. Like I said, this is a very long journey. You may have remembered me saying earlier in the course, like 6 months to 2 years is what it typically takes people. You're just at the beginning. Be patient with yourself. What you're going to see is slowly over time, like things will start clicking and things will start making sense. And here's the beauty of this course. You own it, right? It's not like you watch the videos once and then you never get to use it again, right? You can always come back to the videos. And in fact, I recommend it. I recommend going back and rewatching. I like to compare this to, you ever watch like a really complex movie or a TV show like a Game of Thrones or Westworld, where the first time you watch it through, you're kind of like confused and like barely following the plot maybe, but if you go back and rewatch it a second time after you've already seen it, now you start to pick up on the things, now everything makes more sense, and now you understand it a lot more. This is the same exact thing. You just watched a kind of confusing and complex movie, so after watching it once, you might be like, I'm not really sure where I stand. Go back and rewatch it again, you're going to pick up a lot more. And this overwhelmed feeling you may be having is constant throughout your career. So get used to it, I guess is what I'm trying to say, because the only constant in technology is change, right? Things are constantly changing. And as a programmer and you're evolving with technology, like you're constantly going to be reset back to a beginner. Like maybe not all the way back to where you knew nothing, but like here's the example, right? Like when Swift was just announced, again, back in 2014, everybody was a beginner in Swift. Even just recently, summer of 2019, Swift UI was announced. Everyone was a beginner at Swift UI. So what I'm trying to say is get good at being a beginner, because that's going to be constant throughout your career, and kind of learn to deal with and evolve with this overwhelmed feeling, because you always get it every time you learn something new. And I think the key there is having the determination to battle through this overwhelmed feeling. Like I know some people like aren't willing to go back and rewatch videos or do a tutorial twice, right? They think they can just watch it once and then they know it. Like that's just not how it works. It's like any other skill. You have to practice and drill the fundamentals. So at the end of the day, don't worry about being overwhelmed. We've all felt this. It is perfectly normal. Be patient with yourself. Keep going. Take it little by little. And I guarantee you, 6 months later, you're going to look back and you're going to be amazed at how far you've come. So here you are, wrapping up your beginner course, and you're probably wondering, all right, what's the next step? What do I do next? And well, my first answer you might not like, but what I'm going to recommend, if this was your very first course, if you have a little bit more experience and this was reviewed for you, maybe not, but if you were the absolute beginner and this was like one of your very first courses, I'm going to say run it back. Like I mentioned in a previous video, you just watched a pretty complex movie, go watch it again and you're going to learn a lot more. You may not have to type everything out, but at least rewatching the videos, once you have all this knowledge now, is going to help you out a lot more. And I say to go run it back and rewatch those because I want to instill the habit, or maybe the lack of stigma, that going back and rewatching videos is not a bad thing. Like doing a tutorial twice, not a bad thing. Like I keep saying, repetition is key. You have to drill the fundamentals. Like this is how you get good at things. Think of something you're good at. I don't care, video games, sports, writing, whatever you are good at. Did you just do it a couple times and then you were good at it? No, you practiced it for months, years, whatever, and then you got good at it. This is no different. So what I'm going to do is go back through the videos and add links to blog posts or other learning resources on each of the topics. If it's applicable, not all videos may have these links, but this is a way for you to go back and learn more about that specific topic. And this will be, other people's blog posts, etc. After you've revisited this course, I would recommend going to either hackingwithswift.com or raywunderlich.com. We talked about this in our iOS, resources section of the course, so hopefully those names are familiar to you, but they both have beginner content, whether it's books or videos. I recommend going through that. And even though there will be some crossover, some of it will be repetitive, what I have found when learning is that oftentimes hearing a different teacher explain something a different way will make things click. Because not only are they explaining it a different way, but you're coming into their content with some pre-existing knowledge, right, from this course. Or maybe if you've done their stuff first and you came to this one, right? Just hearing things explained different ways can really be helpful to make that click. And then after that, I may or may not have released this, but I have plans for what I'm calling a Beginner Plus course. And that is the next logical step on concepts after this course. If you're watching this in the first half of 2020, it's not released yet. I plan on releasing this in the second half of 2020. So depending on when you're watching this is if that's available. But if that is available, again, I'm designing that course to be the immediate next step to this course. So that might be a great next step. If not, again, check out Hacking with Swift or Ray Wenderlich. Again, check them out regardless. They have great stuff. Actually, you may have heard me say Ray Wenderlich back in 2015 is how I got my start, is how I learned. Now, after you've explored some of these beginner content, again, Hacking with Swift, Ray Wenderlich, my stuff, and some of the other resources I've put out there, the next big leap you're going to take in your learning is to create your own project. Now, I want to be clear. This does not have to be a world changing app. You don't have to create the next Instagram. This can be dead simple, but it needs to be your own idea. Something that you're not just following a tutorial on. Something that you say, I have this idea. How can I bring that idea to life? And you have to do the research in between to make that happen. But again, it can be super simple, and I actually recommend that it's simple. If you do think you're going to build the next Instagram and you concoct this crazy complex app, you're biting off more than you can chew. And that is very likely, of course you could pull it off, but it is very likely that is going to be more discouraging than helpful. Again, baby steps, long journey, little by little, you'll get there. But building your own project and again, solving your own problems where you don't have a tutorial that spells everything out for you, your learning will accelerate immensely. And that is you taking the next step in your journey. Then once you have the solid foundation, you've done those beginner courses, you've kind of built your own project, I would recommend coming back to my iOS developer take-home project course, the GitHub followers course, because that course was designed to be like the final boss before you start applying for your first real iOS developer job. That course is based on, well, a lot of times when you're interviewing, the company will send you a take-home project and they'll say, hey, you have whatever, 3 to 5 hours, build this project and send it back. And we kind of mimic that whole process, except we go a lot more in depth because again, this course is preparing you for the job interview. So we cover a lot of the main topics that are typically asked in iOS developer job interviews. So like I said, doing that course was designed to be like the final boss before you start applying. It's meant to prepare you for those junior developer job interviews. Now, of course, everyone's path is going to be different. The path I just laid out is very vague and rough, right? You did this beginner course. If my Beginner Plus course is out, take that. Even if it is out, explore Hacking with Swift, Ray Wenderlich, and some of the other iOS developer resources I put out there. Then start building your own project, your own idea. Keep the app simple. Then kind of round it back to my iOS developer take-home project. That's the rough, vague path. But again, it's vague. Make it your own. You don't have to do exactly that, but that is a good roadmap, if you will, to potentially have your full-time job be an iOS developer. And along the way, again, be sure to partake in the community. That's one of my biggest regrets. I didn't start partaking in Twitter and interacting with other iOS developers until I was like 2 years into my career. And I look back, that is one of my biggest regrets. So I implore you, don't be afraid. Hop in the Slack channel, start interacting with us in there. Again, interact on Twitter, like I say in my Twitter video. Trust me, that will pay off in the long run. And then finally, like I said before, I want to stress this, just be patient with yourself. Again, this is a long journey. You've heard me say 6 months to 2 years typically, and I've seen it firsthand. People that have been following me and my YouTube channel, I've watched their whole journey go from I'm just learning to now they're hired full-time iOS developers. Like, it happens every day. So again, be patient. It's worth it. Congratulations, you've completed the course. You've officially begun your journey. Your rocket's taken off. It's exciting times. And I do want to take a second to sincerely thank you. Like, I really enjoy teaching this stuff. I love watching the progression of the students, be it via the comments or the Slack channel. Like, watching students have that I call it that click moment where you can see the light bulb go off and they finally get it. Like, that's the value I get. So, I hope you got value from this course and you may be thankful to me for teaching you. Just know that I'm getting just as much, if not more value, just watching the progression of you all. And again, like I said in previous videos, I've watched people go from knowing nothing to now they're 2 years into their career as an iOS developer. And that is so rewarding. So please keep in touch either via Twitter, the Slack channel, like keep us updated on your journey. Like, not only me, but everybody else in the community, like, love seeing that. Now, for those of you that may not know, This was just the second course I've ever made, the first one being the GitHub Followers course. Now, my audacious goal, I'll admit, is I'm trying to create the best, most premium iOS developer courses, frankly, in the world. I know that's a lofty, audacious goal, but that's what I'm striving for. So I'm absolutely not there yet. Again, this was just my second course, but what I'm going to ask of you, and here's my email, is please provide me some feedback and be brutal. Like, I can take it. Like I said, if you're trying to be, the best, you got to be able to take the tough feedback. So please let me know, what did you enjoy about the course? Like, what should I do more of? And more importantly, I think, like, this is the feedback that I actually look forward to, is the bad stuff. Like, what did you think was too confusing? Do you think I explained something in a wrong way? Just what did you not like about the course? Like, to be quite honest, even though a lot of people don't like sending that email, those are the ones I like getting, because that is how I improve, by fixing all those things. So please, I would love to hear your feedback. And then also, while my email is up there, if you did enjoy the course and you want to leave a testimonial that I can post on a page so future potential students, when they're looking at the course, they can see, let me know. Or just email me a real short blurb, like 2 sentences, and I will put it up there as testimonials on the course. And then finally, if you enjoyed yourself while you were taking this, please tweet about it, share your experience, talk about what you liked about it. I'm happy to jump in there, retweet it. It just really helps spread the word and get my courses out there and more people exposed to, again, what I'm trying to build here with some of the best courses in the world. That's the goal. I'm not claiming that I'm there yet, so I hope I don't get emails like, you're nowhere near that. Like, I know, that's just the long-term goal. We're trying to get better. But again, thank you so much for coming on this journey with me, and I really hope I get to see you in future courses.